Welcome to Level 0 of 100 mind-blowing paradoxes. Level 0, the Liar Paradox. What if someone walked up to you right now and said just 4 words? I am lying to you. Simple enough. But now think about it. If they are telling the truth, then they must actually be lying. But if they are lying, then what they said is true, which means they are telling the truth, which means they are lying again. It never stops. Now let's make it even simpler. Imagine a piece of paper with one sentence written on it. This statement is false. If the sentence is true, then it must be false. But if it is false, then it must be true. It just loops with no way out and no way to settle on an answer. This is the Liar Paradox, and it has broken the minds of philosophers and mathematicians for centuries. Not because it is complicated, but because it is so simple. 7 words and logic collapses completely. Mathematicians in the 20th century took it seriously enough that they had to rebuild the entire foundation of formal logic just to work around problems like this one. There is no answer. The sentence cannot be true, and it cannot be false. It just sits there spinning, and the more you stare at it, the less solid everything else starts to feel. Level 1, the Barber Paradox. What if you lived in a small town with one barber and one simple rule? The barber shaves every man who does not shave himself, and only those men. Sounds fair enough. But now ask one question. Who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, he breaks his own rule because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then by his own rule he must shave himself, because he shaves every man who does not shave himself. Both answers destroy the rule. The barber cannot exist. Not because we cannot find him, but because the logic that defines him makes his existence impossible. Bertrand Russell used this exact problem to expose a crack in the entire foundation of mathematics. At the time, mathematicians were building a perfect logical system that everything could rest on. This one question broke it. The whole project had to be redesigned from scratch. Sometimes the simplest rules collapse the moment you point them at themselves. Level 2. The Ship of Theseus. What if you owned a famous old ship, and over the years the wood started rotting, so you replaced one plank, then another, then the mast, then the hull, one piece at a time until eventually nothing from the original ship remained. Every single part had been swapped out. Is it still the same ship? Most people say yes. It never stopped being a ship. The change was gradual, and the form stayed the same. But now imagine someone had been quietly collecting every old plank as it was removed and rebuilt them into a second ship. Same shape, original materials. Now which one is the real ship? This question does not stay in harbors. Every cell in your body gets replaced over roughly 7 to 10 years. The atoms that made you as a child are completely gone. You carry their memories and their fears, but nothing physical remains of them. So are you the same person you were 10 years ago? And if you are, what exactly makes you that person? Because it is not the matter. The matter is all different now. Level 3, the unexpected hanging. What if a judge looked at you and said you will be executed sometime next week, on a weekday, at noon? But it will be a surprise. You will not know which day until the executioner shows up at your door that morning. You go back to your cell and start thinking, Friday is impossible. If you survive Thursday night, then Friday is the only day left and you would know it was coming. That is not a surprise, so Friday is ruled out. But now Thursday is impossible too. With Friday gone, if you survive Wednesday night, then Thursday has to be the day. And again you would know. Ruled out. The same logic destroys Wednesday, then Tuesday, then Monday. The hanging cannot happen. The judge's sentence is logically impossible. You relax. Wednesday morning, the executioner arrives and you are completely shocked. The judge was right. Philosophers have argued about exactly where the reasoning failed for decades without agreeing on an answer. Every step seems solid, and yet reality walked straight through it. Maybe the problem is not in the logic itself, but in what we assume logic can actually do. Level 4. Zeno's Achilles. What if the fastest man alive could never catch a tortoise? Not because he was slow, but because of the way distance works. Achilles races a tortoise and gives it a 10-meter head start. By the time Achilles reaches where the tortoise started, The tortoise has moved forward a little. By the time he reaches that new spot, the tortoise has moved again. The gap keeps shrinking, but there is always another gap. Infinitely many steps standing between Achilles and catching up. We know he wins. We watch faster things catch slower things every single day. Motion clearly works, but Zeno of Elea used this argument to claim that motion is actually an illusion, and that it should be impossible. The answer came 2,000 years later with calculus. An infinite series of shrinking numbers can add up to a finite total. Infinitely many steps do not require infinite time. But here is what still sits strangely. Space appears to be infinitely divisible. Between any 2 points there is always another point. Yet somehow that infinite gets crossed in ordinary moments on ordinary afternoons without anyone noticing. The math is solved. Whatever is underneath it is not. Level 5. The Sorites Paradox. What if removing 1 grain of sand from a heap meant you no longer had a heap? You would never be able to say exactly when it stopped being one. Remove a grain. Still a heap. Remove another. Still a heap. Keep going. At some point you are holding 1 grain, and 1 grain is obviously not a heap, but there is no single moment you can point to where the heap disappeared. Same thing with baldness. A man loses 1 hair. Not bald. Loses another. Still not bald. Keep going, and eventually nobody disagrees that he is bald, but nobody can name the exact hair that did it. This is the Sorites Paradox, and it shows that many of the words we use every day have no real edges. Rich and poor, young and old, tall and short. They feel precise when we use them, but try to find the exact boundary, and it simply is not there. Some philosophers say language is just imprecise and reality itself is fine. Others think certain parts of reality are genuinely fuzzy with no sharp lines anywhere. And some say questions like exactly when does a heap stop being a heap just have no answer at all, which raises something uncomfortable. If the words we use to describe the world have no clean edges, how precise is our understanding of anything? Level 6. The Grandfather Paradox. What if you built a time machine and traveled back to when your grandfather was young, before he ever met your grandmother, and you prevented them from meeting? They never marry. Your parent is never born, which means you are never born, which means you never built the time machine, which means you never traveled back, which means they do meet, which means you are born, which means you do travel back, which means you prevent the meeting again. The loop has no beginning and no exit. Physicists have taken this seriously. Some argue time travel to the past is simply impossible because of exactly this kind of contradiction. Others propose that traveling back creates a branching timeline where you erase yourself in one reality, but your original timeline continues untouched. Others suggest history resists change, and no matter what you attempt, something always intervenes. Your gun jams. You get lost. Events conspire to preserve the chain. What the Grandfather Paradox really reveals is something deeper than time travel. Cause always comes before effect. We have never seen it any other way. Anything that reverses that order does not just create a problem in time. It creates a problem in the logic that holds reality together. Level 7. The Omnipotence Paradox. What if a being existed that could do absolutely anything? No limits, no exceptions. Now ask it one question. Can you create a rock so heavy that even you cannot lift it? If yes, then there is something it cannot do. Lift the rock, which means it is not truly all-powerful. If no, then there is also something it cannot do. Create the rock in the first place, which means it is still not truly all-powerful. Either answer removes the all-powerful part. This has been debated in philosophy and theology for centuries. Some argue the question is poorly formed and that omnipotence does not mean the ability to do logically impossible things. A square circle cannot exist, not because of limited power, but because the concept destroys itself. Others argue an all-powerful being could choose to limit itself, create the unliftable rock, and then simply choose not to lift it. But even that answer has something worth pulling on. If a being can choose to become less powerful, was it ever truly unlimited to begin with? Or does the capacity for self-limitation mean that total power was always quietly bounded? Level 8. The Bootstrap Paradox. What if your favorite song was never actually written by anyone? What if a musician from the future traveled back in time and handed the sheet music to a young unknown composer who then published it? That song became legendary. The musician from the future grew up hearing it, learned to play it, and eventually traveled back in time to hand it to the composer. Who wrote it? Nobody. It exists in a loop with no origin. It appeared in the past because it came from the future. It appeared in the future because it came from the past. No one created it, but it is real. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, and unlike the Grandfather Paradox, it does not collapse into contradiction. The loop is internally consistent. Nothing blows up, it just has no beginning. And that might actually be more disturbing. We assume everything comes from something. Every creation has a creator. Every effect has a cause somewhere behind it. The Bootstrap Paradox suggests that in a universe where time travel is possible, some things might simply exist with no origin at all. Not because they were made, not because they evolved, just because they do. Level 9. Russell's Paradox. What if there was a catalogue in a library that listed every book which did not list itself? Now ask one question. Should the catalogue list itself? If it does, then it should not be in there because it only lists books that do not list themselves. If it does not, then it should be in there because it is a book that does not list itself. Either answer makes the other answer necessary. Bertrand Russell discovered this same problem in mathematics in 1901 using sets instead of books. The set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does it contain itself? The same loop, the same collapse. What makes this more than a clever puzzle is what it destroyed. Mathematicians at the time were building an ambitious project to reduce all of mathematics to a perfect set of logical rules, a complete and airtight foundation. Russell's paradox cracked it wide open, and the entire project had to be rebuilt from scratch with new rules designed specifically to stop sets from doing this to themselves. The ghost of it is still there, though, hidden in the architecture, a reminder that even the most careful systems of thought can carry a contradiction inside them, patient and invisible, until someone asks exactly the right question. Level 10. The Experience Machine. What if someone offered you a perfect life, a machine that simulates everything you have ever wanted? Real love, real success, real happiness, every experience indistinguishable from reality. You would never know you were inside it. From the inside, every moment would feel completely real. The only thing you have to give up is the actual world. Would you plug in? Philosopher Robert Nozick designed this thought experiment to test one idea. If pleasure and positive experience are the only things that matter, then the machine is an obvious choice. It delivers them perfectly, without the failure and loss and pain of real life. But most people hesitate, or refuse entirely. Nozick argued that people want to actually do things, not just have the experience of doing them. They want contact with a reality that exists outside their own mind, even when that reality is hard. Something about the simulation does not count. Like winning a race in a dream. You wake up having crossed no finish line. But here is the thing that makes this one linger. How would you know you are not already inside it? How would you know that what you are experiencing right now is the actual world and not a version of it that someone else designed for you? You probably cannot know, and somehow most people are fine with that. Level 11. The Trolley Problem. What if you were standing next to a lever and a runaway trolley was heading toward 5 people tied to the tracks? All you have to do is pull the lever and the trolley switches to a different track. But there is one person tied to that track. Do you pull it? Most people say yes. 1 death instead of 5. The math seems clear. But now change the scenario slightly. Instead of a lever, imagine you are on a bridge above the tracks and the only way to stop the trolley is to push a large man standing next to you onto the tracks. His body would stop it. 5 people live. 1 dies. The numbers are exactly the same, but almost nobody pushes. That is the strange part. The outcome is identical, but something about using your hands, about making direct physical contact with the person you are sacrificing, feels completely different from pulling a lever. The math did not change. Only the method did. Philosophers have used this to argue that human moral reasoning is not actually logical. We have 2 separate systems running at the same time. One calculates outcomes, and one reacts to physical actions, and they do not always agree with each other. So when you make a moral decision, are you reasoning or are you just rationalizing what your gut already decided? Level 12. The Paradox of Free Will. What if every choice you have ever made was already determined before you made it? not by fate or destiny but by physics. Your brain is made of atoms. Atoms follow the laws of nature. The laws of nature are fixed, so every thought you have ever had, every decision you have ever made, was the inevitable result of particles doing exactly what particles do, which means you never actually chose anything. But that feels wrong. You feel like you are choosing right now. You feel the weight of decisions. You feel regret about past ones. That feeling of choosing seems real. Here is where it gets strange. Even if everything is determined, that does not necessarily mean the feeling of choice is an illusion. Some philosophers argue that free will and determinism can exist together, that acting from your own desires and reasoning counts as freedom, even if those desires were shaped by things before you. Others say that is just a way of making peace with something uncomfortable, that if your choices were fixed before you were born, then holding anyone responsible for anything becomes very hard to justify. And some neuroscience research suggests your brain makes decisions before you're even conscious of them. Before you feel like you decided, the decision is already done. So who exactly is doing the choosing? Level 13, the twin paradox. What if you had an identical twin, and one of you got on a spaceship traveling close to the speed of light, while the other stayed on Earth? Years pass, the spaceship comes back, and when you stand next to each other, one of you is noticeably younger than the other. This is not science fiction. It is a real consequence of Einstein's theory of relativity, and it has been confirmed by actual experiments.
But here is where the paradox comes in. From the perspective of the twin on the spaceship, it was Earth that was moving away at high speed. So by the same logic, Earth twin should be the younger one. Both twins should be able to claim the other was the one moving. So which one actually aged slower? The answer is the one on the spaceship, and the reason is that the situation is not actually symmetrical. The spaceship twin had to accelerate to turn around and come back. That acceleration breaks the symmetry. Only one of them changed direction, and that is the one who ends up younger. Time does not pass at the same rate everywhere. It depends on how fast you are moving and how much you accelerate. Two people can live through the same span of time and arrive at completely different ages. The universe does not keep one clock. It keeps a different one for everyone. Level 14. The problem of evil. What if there is a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and completely good? Now look at the world. Disease, war, children born into suffering they never chose and never deserved, natural disasters that erase entire communities in minutes. If God is all-powerful, he could stop this. If he is all-knowing, he is aware of every moment of it. If he is completely good, he would want to. So why does it happen? This is one of the oldest questions in philosophy and theology, and it has never been cleanly resolved. Some argue that suffering exists because of free will, that a world where humans can choose to do good must also be a world where they can choose to cause harm. But that does not explain the earthquakes. That does not explain the children. Others argue that suffering builds character and produces resilience and depth that a painless life never could. But that raises an uncomfortable question about whether the ends justify the means, and whether a truly good being would design a system that requires suffering to function. And some say the existence of evil is the strongest evidence that an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God simply does not exist. None of these answers fully satisfies, and maybe that is the point. Some questions are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be lived with. Level 15, the Fermi Paradox. What if the universe is full of intelligent life, and we just cannot find any of it? The numbers say it should be out there, hundreds of billions of galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars. Many of those stars with planets in the right zone for life. If even a tiny fraction of those planets developed intelligent civilizations, the galaxy should be buzzing with signals and activity, and yet silence. No signals, no visitors, no evidence of anyone else anywhere. This is the Fermi Paradox, and physicist Enrico Fermi captured it in one question. Where is everybody? There are many possible answers, and none of them are particularly comforting. Maybe intelligent life is far rarer than the math suggests, and we are genuinely alone. Maybe civilizations tend to destroy themselves before they ever reach the point of broadcasting into space. Maybe someone is out there but deliberately staying quiet because making contact is dangerous. Or maybe the silence means something even stranger. Maybe there is a filter, some step in the development of intelligent life that is nearly impossible to pass, and we either already passed it, or it is still ahead of us. If it is still ahead of us, that is not a comforting thought at all. Level 16, Schrodinger's cat.
What if a cat was both alive and dead at the same time, and the only thing that decided which one it was whether or not you looked?
Physicist Erwin Schrodinger designed this thought experiment to show how strange quantum mechanics really is. A cat is sealed in a box with a radioactive atom that has a 50% chance of decaying within an hour. If it decays, a mechanism releases poison and the cat dies. If it does not, the cat lives. Before you open the box, quantum mechanics says the atom exists in a superposition. It has both decayed and not decayed at the same time, which means the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. The moment you open the box and observe it, reality picks one. Schrodinger meant this as a criticism. He thought the idea that observation collapses reality into one outcome was absurd when applied to something as large as a cat. But experiments kept confirming it. The math kept working. The observation effect is real at the quantum level, even if we cannot fully explain what it means at the scale of cats and people. So the question it leaves behind is uncomfortable. Does reality have a definite state before someone looks at it? Or does the act of looking actually create the outcome? And if it does, who was looking at the universe before anyone existed to look? Level 17, the simulation hypothesis. What if you are not real in the way you think you are? Not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. What if the world you are experiencing right now is a simulation running inside a computer built by a civilization far more advanced than ours? Philosopher Nick Bostrom argued that at least one of three things must be true. Either civilizations like ours almost always go extinct before reaching the point where they can build realistic simulations, or advanced civilizations exist but have no interest in running them, or we are almost certainly living inside one right now. The reasoning is simple. If any civilization ever builds the technology to run detailed simulations of conscious beings, they would likely run enormous numbers of them, which means simulated minds would vastly outnumber real ones, which means the odds that you are one of the real ones are very small. Some physicists have pointed out that our universe does behave strangely like a simulation. It has a resolution limit at the quantum level. It follows precise mathematical rules. It seems almost designed to be computable. But here is the thing that makes this one genuinely hard to shake. Even if it is true, there is no way to prove it from inside. Every experiment you could run, every test you could design, would be part of the simulation. The evidence for reality and the evidence for simulation would look exactly the same. You would never know. And somehow you have to keep living anyway. Level 18, the Black Hole Information Paradox. What if everything that falls into a black hole is destroyed forever? Not moved, not transformed, erased. Every detail about what it was made of, what information it contained gone completely. That would break physics. One of the most fundamental rules in quantum mechanics is that information cannot be destroyed. If you burned every copy of a book, the ash and smoke would still carry the information in some scrambled form. In theory, with perfect knowledge, you could reconstruct it. Information transforms, but it does not disappear. Black holes seem to violate this completely. Anything that crosses the event horizon appears to be lost forever. And Stephen Hawking showed that black holes eventually evaporate. When they do, whatever fell in seems to be gone with them. So either quantum mechanics is wrong, or general relativity is wrong, or both are incomplete in ways we do not yet understand. Physicists have been arguing about this for decades. Some think information escapes encoded in the Hawking radiation in a form too scrambled to read. Some think it is stored on the surface of the event horizon, like a hologram. Nobody has solved it yet. And whatever the answer turns out to be, it will change something fundamental about how we understand reality. Level 19, the Boltzmann Brain. What if you are not a person who evolved over billions of years on a planet that formed from stardust around an ordinary star? What if you are a brain that spontaneously assembled itself from random particles in empty space just moments ago, complete with false memories of a life you never actually lived? This sounds absurd, but physicist Ludwig Boltzmann's work on thermodynamics leads somewhere deeply strange. In an infinite universe, random fluctuations will eventually produce any possible arrangement of matter given enough time. And here is the uncomfortable part. A single brain with preloaded memories is far simpler, and therefore far more likely to spontaneously form than an entire universe with billions of years of history. Which means, In an infinite universe, randomly assembled brains would vastly outnumber real evolved ones, which means statistically you are more likely to be a Boltzmann brain than a real person. Everything you remember, every person you love, every place you have been, it could all be false memories that appeared in the same moment you did, a moment ago, before you dissolve back into empty space. You cannot prove this is not the case, and the only reason most physicists reject it is that it would make science itself meaningless. If your memories and perceptions cannot be trusted, then no experiment can be trusted either. So we assume it is not true, because the alternative is unworkable, not because we can rule it out. Level 20, Moore's Paradox.
What if you could say something that was perfectly true in every part and yet completely impossible to sincerely mean?
George Edward Moore noticed something strange about a particular kind of sentence. Not a lie, not a contradiction, just a sentence that somehow cannot be genuinely said. The example is simple. It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining. Think about that for a moment. Both halves could independently be true. It really could be raining. The speaker really could not believe it. There is no logical contradiction between those two facts. And yet if someone actually said that sentence to you in conversation, something would feel deeply wrong. The problem is this. When you assert something, you are not just reporting a fact. You are also implying that you believe it. That implication is always there. It is part of what it means to say something sincerely. So when someone says it is raining, they are also telling you they believe it. Both things happen at once every time anyone says anything, which means the sentence "it is raining, but I do not believe it is raining" does two things at once. It asserts something which implies belief, and then denies that belief in the same breath. You could never sincerely say it. You could write it as an example. You could report someone else said it, but you could never step forward and mean it the way a normal assertion is meant. The sentence defeats itself the moment it becomes genuine. And that is a strange thing to realize, that some sentences are perfectly grammatical, perfectly logical, and completely uninhabitable. Level 21, the Paradox of Tolerance. What if a society decided to tolerate everything, every belief, every ideology, every viewpoint, no matter how extreme? Sounds like the most open and fair society imaginable. But now what happens when a group rises within that society whose entire goal is to destroy tolerance itself? If the society tolerates them, they grow, they spread, they gain power, and eventually they dismantle the very tolerance that allowed them to exist in the first place. The tolerant society destroys itself by being too tolerant. But if the society chooses not to tolerate them, then it is being intolerant, which means it has already abandoned the thing it was trying to protect. Karl Popper identified this in 1945 and called it the paradox of tolerance. A society that tolerates everything, including intolerance, will eventually be consumed by it. So to preserve tolerance, you must be willing to be intolerant of intolerance. But the moment you do that, you have accepted that tolerance has limits. And once you accept that it has limits, the question becomes, who decides where those limits are? And whoever decides that holds enormous power. There is no clean resolution. Every answer creates a new problem, and every society that has ever existed has had to quietly pick a position on this without ever fully admitting it. Level 22, the Paradox of Hedonism. What if the harder you chased happiness, the less of it you found? Not because happiness does not exist, but because the act of chasing it directly is exactly what makes it disappear. Think about it. The people who seem most genuinely happy are usually not the ones who made happiness their goal. They were absorbed in something else, a craft, a relationship, a cause bigger than themselves. Happiness arrived as a side effect of caring about something other than happiness. But the people who make feeling good the primary objective, who optimize every decision around maximizing pleasure and minimizing discomfort, often end up restless and dissatisfied no matter how much they acquire. Philosopher John Stuart Mill noticed this in his own life. He had been raised to pursue happiness through reason and achievement. Then he had a breakdown and realized that the direct pursuit of happiness was self-defeating. The moment you ask yourself, "Am I happy yet?" the question itself gets in the way of the answer. So here is the paradox. The best way to find happiness might be to stop looking for it.
But the moment you hear that and try to stop looking for it in order to find it, you are still looking for it. You cannot trick yourself out of it on purpose. It either arrives or it does not, and it almost never arrives when you are watching the door. Level 23, the Paradox of Choice. What if having more options made you less satisfied with whatever you chose? Not more satisfied, less. Psychologist Barry Schwartz found exactly this. In a study on jam, 2 groups of shoppers were offered samples. One group had 6 flavors to choose from. The other had 24. The group with more options stopped to try more samples but bought far less jam. The group with fewer options bought more and reported being happier with what they chose. More options created more doubt. More doubt created more regret. More regret made the choice feel worse even when the jam tasted exactly the same. This scales up to everything. Career choices, relationships, where to live. The more options you have, the easier it is to imagine that one of the other ones might have been better. And that imaginary better option haunts every decision you make.
The paradox is that freedom of choice is supposed to be one of the best things about modern life. More options means more control, means more happiness. But at a certain point, the opposite happens. Too much choice becomes its own kind of trap. You are free to choose anything, and that freedom is exactly what makes it so hard to feel good about what you picked. The happiest choices are often made by people who had fewer options and therefore fewer reasons to second-guess themselves, which raises an uncomfortable question about whether the life you have built from unlimited options is actually making you happier than a simpler one would have. Level 24, Buridan's Ass. What if a perfectly rational being could starve to death with food on both sides of it simply because it could not find a reason to prefer one over the other? A donkey stands exactly halfway between 2 identical piles of hay. Same size, same distance, same quality. The donkey is perfectly logical. It always chooses the best option. But both options are completely equal, so there is no best option. No logical reason to go left instead of right. So it stands there and starves. This is Buridan's Ass, and it exposes something strange about pure rationality. A being that only acts when it has a logical reason to prefer one option will be paralyzed the moment 2 options are perfectly equal. Real decisions require something beyond logic: instinct, randomness, preference without justification. The willingness to just pick something even when you cannot explain why. Humans do this constantly without noticing. You choose a restaurant without fully knowing why. You go left at an intersection because it felt right. You make dozens of decisions every day with no clear logical basis, and your life functions perfectly well because of it. The paradox suggests that pure rationality is not actually a complete system for navigating the world. At some point, every decision requires a leap that reason alone cannot justify. And maybe the most rational thing you can do is accept that. Level 25. The Prisoner's Dilemma. What if the most logical choice for both of you guaranteed that you both lost? 2 people are arrested and put in separate rooms. Each is given the same offer. If you betray the other person and they stay silent, you go free, and they get 10 years. If you both stay silent, you each get 1 year. If you both betray each other, you each get 5 years. You cannot talk to each other. You do not know what they will choose. The logical thing from your side is to betray. If they stay silent, you go free. If they betray you, at least you get 5 years instead of 10. Betraying is better for you no matter what they do. They go through the exact same reasoning. So you both betray, and you both get 5 years. But if you had both stayed silent, you would have each gotten 1 year. The individually logical choice produced a collectively worse outcome. This shows up everywhere. 2 companies that would both profit more from cooperation instead undercut each other into a price war. 2 countries that would both be safer with fewer weapons keep building more because neither trusts the other to stop first. 2 people in a relationship both hold back vulnerability because neither wants to be the first one to get hurt. The math is the same every time. Individual logic, collective disaster. The only way out is trust, and trust is exactly the thing the situation is designed to destroy. Level 26, the Paradox of the Court. What if a legal agreement could create a situation where fulfilling it and breaking it meant exactly the same thing? A law student makes a deal with his teacher. He will only pay for his lessons if he wins his first court case. He finishes his studies and never takes a case. The teacher gets frustrated and sues him for payment. Now the paradox begins. The teacher argues that if the student loses this case, then the court has ordered him to pay and he must pay. But if the student wins this case, then he has won his first case, which means by the original agreement, he now has to pay anyway. Either way, he pays. The student argues the opposite. If he wins this case, the court has ruled he does not have to pay. If he loses this case, he has still never won a case, so by the original agreement, he does not have to pay either. Either way, he does not pay. Both arguments are internally consistent. Both follow logically from the same agreement. The contract has created a situation where any outcome justifies two completely opposite conclusions at the same time. Courts still face versions of this. Contracts and laws that reference their own conditions in ways that loop back on themselves. And there is no clean logical fix. At some point, someone in authority simply has to make a call and the logic gets set aside, which makes you wonder how much of the law is logic and how much of it is just whoever decides first. Level 27, the Raven Paradox. What if looking at a red apple gave you scientific evidence that all ravens are black? It sounds completely absurd, but the logic holds, and that is exactly what makes it a paradox. The statement all ravens are black is logically equivalent to saying everything that is not black is not a raven. These two statements mean the same thing. If one is true, the other must be true. If one is false, the other must be false. Now, every time you observe something that is not black and also not a raven, a red apple, a green leaf, a yellow taxi, you are technically confirming that everything that is not black is not a raven, which means you are confirming that all ravens are black. By sitting in a room looking at colored objects that have nothing to do with ravens, you are doing ornithology. Philosopher Carl Hempel introduced this in 1945, and it has never been fully resolved. Some say the confirmation is technically real, but so tiny it is meaningless compared to actually observing a black raven. Others say it reveals that our intuitions about evidence and relevance are not captured by formal logic. Others say the problem is in how we define confirmation itself. But the strangest part is this. The logic is valid, the math checks out. A red apple really does provide some evidence that all ravens are black, and somehow that feels more wrong the more you think about it. Level 28, the Paradox of Omniscience. What if knowing everything made certain things impossible? A being that is truly omniscient knows everything that has happened, is happening, and will happen, including every choice every person will ever make, including its own future choices. But if its own future choices are already known, then can it choose differently? If it already knows it will do something tomorrow, can it decide today not to do it? If it can, then its knowledge was wrong, and it is not truly omniscient. If it cannot, then it is not truly free, and its omniscience has eliminated its own agency. The same problem applies to human free will under an omniscient God. If God already knows what you will choose, then your choice is already determined. Not by force, but by the fact that the future is already knowable, and a determined choice is not really a choice. Some philosophers argue that omniscience could exist outside of time, seeing all moments simultaneously, rather than predicting a future that has not happened yet. From that perspective, your choices are real and free, and God simply observes them all at once rather than in sequence. Others say this does not help, because if all moments are already fixed in the view of an omniscient being, then the future is just as determined as the past. The harder you push on the idea of knowing everything, the more the knowing starts to look like controlling. And a being that controls everything that will ever happen is something quite different from one that simply loves and observes. Level 29, the Problem of Induction. What if you had no logical reason to believe the sun will rise tomorrow? Not because something might go wrong, but because the entire way we reason about the future is built on a foundation that cannot justify itself. Every time you assume the future will resemble the past, you are using inductive reasoning. The sun rose yesterday, and the day before, and every day before that for your entire life, so it will rise tomorrow. That feels airtight, but philosopher David Hume pointed out a problem. The only reason you trust inductive reasoning is that it has worked in the past, but using the past to justify trusting the past is circular. You are assuming the thing you are trying to prove. The argument eats itself. There is no purely logical basis for believing the future will behave like the past. We assume it will because it always has. But that assumption is exactly what we are trying to justify. Science runs entirely on induction. Every experiment assumes that the results will hold under similar conditions in the future. Every scientific law is a pattern observed in the past that we trust will continue.
And there is no non-circular argument for why it should. Hume did not think we should stop doing science. He just thought we should be honest about what it rests on. Not proof, not logic, just a very deep and very reasonable habit. The habit that the universe tomorrow will be the same kind of universe it was today, which it probably will be, but not because we can prove it. Level 30. The Paradox of Confirmation. What if every single piece of evidence you found confirmed your theory even when the evidence had nothing to do with it? You believe that all swans are white. You go out and find a white swan. Confirmed. You find another. Confirmed again. You find 1,000 white swans, and your confidence grows. The theory feels solid. But now you walk into a room and see a red chair, not a swan, not white. But logically, the statement all swans are white means exactly the same thing, as everything that is not white is not a swan, and a red chair is not white and it is not a swan. So technically, the red chair also confirms your theory. Every non-white, non-swan object in the universe is silently confirming that all swans are white. The black shoes on your feet, the green grass outside, the dark sky above you right now. And then one day someone finds a black swan in Australia, and the theory collapses. All of that confirmation meant nothing. This is what philosophers call the problem of confirmation, and it reveals something unsettling about how science actually works. Evidence that confirms a theory does not prove it. No matter how much confirming evidence you accumulate, a single counterexample can undo all of it instantly. We never actually prove theories true. We just fail to prove them false, and we call that knowledge, which is a strange thing to build civilization on. But here we are. Level 31, the Lottery Paradox. What if it was completely rational to believe something you knew was false? A lottery has 1,000,000 tickets. Only one will win. You buy a ticket. The odds of winning are 1 in 1,000,000, so it is completely rational to believe your ticket will lose. That belief is justified. The probability supports it. But now apply that same reasoning to every ticket in the lottery. It is rational to believe ticket 1 will lose. Rational to believe ticket 2 will lose. Rational to believe ticket 3 will lose. Apply this to all 1,000,000 tickets, and you rationally believe that every single ticket will lose. But one ticket must win. You know that. The lottery only works if someone wins, so you hold two beliefs at the same time. Every ticket will lose, and one ticket will win. Both feel rational. Both cannot be true. Philosopher Henry Keiberg introduced this in 1961, and it has never been cleanly resolved. It exposes a crack in how we think about rational belief. We assume that if it is rational to believe each part of something, it should be rational to believe the whole thing. But here, believing each part leads to believing something you know is impossible. Maybe rationality does not scale the way we think it does. Maybe what makes sense for one case breaks down when you apply it everywhere at once. Or maybe we have been wrong about what rational belief actually means. Level 32, the two-envelope paradox. What if switching your choice always seemed mathematically better, even though it could not possibly be? You are given two envelopes. One contains twice as much money as the other. You do not know which is which. You open yours and find $100. Now you are offered a chance to switch. You think about it. The other envelope either has $50 or $200, both equally likely. If you switch and it has $200, you gain $100. If you switch and it has $50, you lose $50. The expected gain from switching is higher than the expected loss. So you should switch. But here is the problem. This logic works no matter what amount you find in your envelope. If you found $50, the same math says switch. If you found $1,000, the same math says switch. The logic always says switch, which means before you even open your envelope, you should plan to switch. But if you always switch, then what was the point of choosing in the first place? The math seems sound at every step, and yet the conclusion is clearly wrong. You cannot always benefit from switching when the envelopes are symmetric. The error is subtle. The calculation treats the other envelope as if both 50 and 200 are equally likely given that yours has 100. But that assumption does not actually hold once you know the amount in your envelope. The numbers feel like they are telling you something. They are not. And that is the trap. Level 33, Hilbert's Hotel. What if a hotel was completely full and could still take in as many new guests as you wanted? Not by turning anyone away, not by building new rooms, just by moving people around. David Hilbert imagined a hotel with infinitely many rooms all numbered and all occupied. A new guest arrives. The manager asks every current guest to move to the next room. Guest in room 1 moves to room 2. Guest in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on forever. Room 1 is now empty. The new guest checks in. The hotel was full. It is still full, and it has one more guest than before. Now imagine an infinite number of new guests arrive. The manager asks every current guest to move to the room that is double their current number. Guest in room 1 moves to room 2. Guest in room 2 moves to room 4. Guest in room 3 moves to room 6. All the odd-numbered rooms are now empty. Infinitely many rooms. All the new guests check in. This is not a trick. This is how infinity actually works. It does not behave like large numbers. It behaves like something else entirely. You can add to it and it stays the same size. You can double it and it stays the same size. You can remove infinite portions of it and still have the same amount left. Our intuitions about size and fullness and more and less were built for finite things. Infinity is not a very large finite thing. It is a different kind of thing completely, and the hotel is the simplest way to feel that difference. Level 34, the St. Petersburg Paradox. What if a game was mathematically worth an infinite amount of money, but nobody would pay more than $20 to play it? The game works like this. A coin is flipped until it lands tails. If it lands tails on the first flip, you win $2. If it lands tails on the second flip, you win $4. Third flip, 8. Fourth flip, 16. The payout doubles every time, and you keep playing until tails appears. Now calculate the expected value. There is a 50% chance of winning $2, a 25% chance of winning $4, a 12.5% chance of winning $8. When you add all of these up, the expected value is infinite. Mathematically, you should be willing to pay any amount to play this game, because the expected return is unlimited. But nobody would pay $10,000 to play it. Most people would not pay $50. The math says the game is worth infinite money. Human intuition says it is worth almost nothing. Both cannot be right. The reason is that expected value as a concept breaks down when the potential gains are unlimited. In real life, a small chance of an astronomically large payout does not feel worth much, because you will almost certainly just win $2 or $4 and walk away. The infinite tail of the distribution exists mathematically, but it will never show up in your actual life. The paradox reveals that the way we mathematically model value and the way humans actually experience value are two completely different things. And building systems on the assumption that they are the same has caused a lot of problems. Level 35. The Birthday Paradox. What if in a room of just 23 people, there was already a 50% chance that 2 of them shared a birthday? And in a room of 57 people, that chance jumped to 99%. That feels wrong. There are 365 days in a year. 23 people should not be enough to make a shared birthday likely. But the mistake is in how we think about the comparison. We imagine checking our own birthday against everyone else in the room, but that is not what is happening. Every person's birthday is being compared to every other person's birthday. In a room of 23 people, there are 253 unique pairs. That is 253 chances for a match. When you look at it that way, the probability stops feeling surprising. The birthday paradox shows up in computer security. Attackers use similar math to crack encryption faster than expected. It shows up in DNA databases where false matches occur more often than people assume. It shows up anywhere that large numbers of comparisons are being made invisibly in the background. We are bad at estimating probabilities that involve combinations rather than individual chances. Our brains track single comparisons. The world runs on pair comparisons, and the difference between those two things is almost always larger than we expect. Level 36. The Monty Problem. What if switching your answer doubled your chances of being right and almost nobody believed it?
You are on a game show. 3 doors. Behind one is a car. Behind the other 2 are goats. You pick door 1. The host, who knows what is behind every door, opens door 3 to reveal a goat. Now he offers you a chance to switch to door 2. Should you switch? Most people say it does not matter. 2 doors left, 50-50. No reason to switch. But switching actually doubles your chances of winning. If you stay, you win only if your original choice was right, which happens 1/3 of the time. If you switch, you win whenever your original choice was wrong, which happens 2/3 of the time. When this was published in a magazine in 1990, thousands of people wrote in to say the answer was wrong, including mathematics professors. The outrage was enormous. The reason it feels wrong is that we assume the host opening a door gives us new information about our door. It does not. Our door was chosen randomly before the host did anything. The host always opens a losing door, which means the other remaining door absorbs all the probability that was spread across the 2 doors we did not pick. The math is correct. The instinct is wrong. And the gap between those 2 things is so uncomfortable that even people who understand the explanation still feel like the answer should be 50-50. Level 37. The Paradox of the Preface. What if a person could be completely rational and completely contradictory at the same time without even noticing? An author finishes writing a book. They have spent years researching every claim. They have checked every source. They believe every single sentence in the book is true. Otherwise, they would not have written it. But in the preface, they write something like this: "Despite my best efforts, this book almost certainly contains errors. I apologize in advance for any mistakes." And they mean it. They genuinely believe at least one thing in the book is probably wrong, because they are a reasonable person who knows that even careful researchers make mistakes. So now they hold 2 beliefs simultaneously. Every sentence in this book is true, and at least one sentence in this book is false. Both feel rational. Both feel justified. And both cannot be true at the same time. This is the paradox of the preface, and it reveals something strange about rational belief. We assume that a rational person's belief should be consistent, that you cannot justifiably believe A and also believe not A. But here a genuinely careful and honest person ends up doing exactly that. Maybe the problem is that rationality does not always produce consistency. Maybe holding calibrated uncertainty means you sometimes have to accept that your beliefs as a whole contain a contradiction, even when you cannot find it. Or maybe being truly rational means accepting that you are probably wrong about something right now. You just do not know which thing. Level 38. Olbers Paradox. What if the night sky should be completely bright, and the fact that it is dark is one of the strangest things about the universe? If the universe is infinite and filled with an infinite number of stars, then no matter which direction you look, your line of sight should eventually hit the surface of a star. Just like standing in an infinite forest means every direction eventually hits a tree. The entire sky should be as bright as the surface of the sun. But the sky is dark. You can see the stars, but there are vast stretches of blackness between them. How? This is Olbers Paradox, and the answer it led to changed our understanding of the universe completely. The sky is dark at night because the universe is not infinitely old. Light travels at a fixed speed. Stars that are far enough away have not had time to send their light to us yet. The universe began around 14 billion years ago, and we can only see light from stars whose light has had time to reach us. Beyond a certain distance, the universe is simply too young for the light to have arrived. The darkness is not an absence, it is a horizon. Everything beyond it exists but has not reached us yet, and that means every time you look up at a dark patch of night sky, you are looking at the edge of what time has allowed you to see. Not emptiness, just light that has not arrived yet, which is a strange thing to realize while lying in the dark. Level 39. The Drinker Paradox. What if you could prove with perfect logic that in any pub right now there exists one person such that if that person is drinking, then everyone in the pub is drinking? This is not a claim about reality, it is a claim about logic, and it holds no matter how many people are in the pub or how many of them are drinking. Here is why. Either everyone in the pub is drinking or not everyone is drinking. Those are the only 2 options. If everyone is drinking, then pick any person at all. That person is drinking, and since everyone is drinking, the statement "if that person is drinking, then everyone is drinking" is trivially true. It holds for that person. If not everyone is drinking, then there is at least one person who is not drinking. Call them the chosen person. The statement "if the chosen person is drinking, then everyone is drinking has a false first part. The chosen person is not drinking, and in logic, a statement that begins with a false condition is automatically true, regardless of what follows. So in both cases, the statement holds for at least one person. The logic is watertight, and yet it produces a conclusion that sounds completely absurd. What the drinker paradox actually reveals is something strange about how logical implication works. A true if-then statement does not require any real connection between the two parts. It just requires that you cannot have the first part true and the second part false at the same time, which creates all kinds of technically valid statements that mean nothing at all. Logic is more permissive than it looks, and that permissiveness is occasionally unsettling. Level 40. The Paradox of Self-Amendment. What if a law that could change itself was neither stable nor truly changeable? Imagine a legal system with one supreme rule. This rule can only be changed by a unanimous vote. Simple and clear. But now the unanimous voters decide to change the rule so that future rules only require a majority vote. Did they just break the rule or follow it? They followed it. The change was made unanimously, so it meets the original requirement. But what they changed it to is a system that allows future changes with less agreement, which means the original rule that required unanimity has now been replaced by something weaker. The rule changed itself into something that could not have created itself, and if the new majority later votes to restore the original unanimity requirement, did the original rule ever really die? Or was it just sleeping? This paradox appears in real constitutional law. Some constitutions contain clauses that cannot be amended even by unanimous agreement. Others can be changed by the very process they establish. When a rule defines the process for changing itself, it creates strange loops where the rule is simultaneously above the process and subject to it. Artificial intelligence researchers think about this too. If an AI system is programmed with rules that include "do not change your core programming," and it later modifies that rule, did it break its original programming? Or was it always allowed to evolve? The rule cannot answer its own question. Any system that tries to govern its own modification runs into the same wall. The rules are never quite in charge of themselves. Level 41. The Friendship Paradox. What if on average your friends have more friends than you do? Not because you are unpopular, but because of the way networks mathematically work. Think about your social circle. Most of the people in it have a moderate number of friends, but some people you know are very well connected. They appear in many different social circles. They show up at every gathering. They know everyone. Now here is the key. The more friends someone has, the more likely they are to be your friend, because people with many connections appear more often across the network. So when you look at your list of friends, it is naturally skewed toward people who are more connected than average. This is not a feeling. It is a mathematical property of networks. In any social network, the average person's friends have more friends than the average person does. Always. The same effect shows up on social media. The people you follow tend to have more followers than you, not because you specifically are less popular, but because highly followed accounts appear in more feeds and attract more followers, and so they are overrepresented in everyone's network. You are not below average. You are just experiencing a statistical property that affects everyone simultaneously. Every single person in a network can feel like they have fewer friends than their friends do, and every single one of them can be right. Level 42. Newcomb's Paradox. What if the rational choice and the winning choice were always different? A being with a perfect prediction record presents you with two boxes. Box A is transparent and contains $1,000. Box B is opaque and contains either $1 million or nothing. The being already made its prediction before you arrived. If it predicted you would take only box B, it put $1 million inside. If it predicted you would take both boxes, it left box B empty. Do you take only box B, or do you take both? One argument says, take both. The money is already in the boxes. Your choice cannot change what is already there. Taking both guarantees you at least $1,000 more than taking one. The other argument says, take only box B. The being has a perfect record. Everyone who took both boxes found box B empty. Everyone who took only box B found $1 million. The pattern is clear. Both arguments are logically valid. Both lead to different choices, and they cannot both be right. This paradox splits decision theorists completely. Some say the rational choice is always to take both, because past predictions cannot change present reality. Others say the rational choice is to take only box B, because rationality should produce winning outcomes, and taking both always loses. The paradox forces a question that has no comfortable answer. Is rationality about following the right process or about getting the right result? And what do you do when those two things point in opposite directions? Level 43. The infinite regress of causes. What if every explanation you gave required another explanation, and there was no bottom? You ask, why does the ball fall when you drop it? Gravity. Why does gravity work? Because mass curves space-time. Why does mass curve space-time? Because of the structure of the universe. Why does the universe have that structure? And so on. Every answer generates a new why. Every explanation sits on top of another explanation that also needs explaining. You can keep going indefinitely, and there is no obvious place where the chain ends naturally. 3 options present themselves, and none of them are satisfying. The first is infinite regress. The chain of causes goes back forever with no beginning. Every event caused by a prior event going back without end. This is logically possible, but it means there is no first cause and no ultimate explanation for anything. The second is a circular chain. Causes loop back on each other eventually. A causes B, causes C, causes A. The explanations are complete, but they do not ground out in anything outside the loop. The third is an uncaused first cause, something that exists without being caused, something that just is. This stops the regress, but it requires accepting that at least one thing requires no explanation. And once you accept that, you have to ask why that thing gets to be the exception. There is no fourth option. Every chain of explanations terminates in one of these 3 places, and philosophers and physicists have been uncomfortable about that for a very long time. Level 44. The paradox of the grain of millet. What if a single grain of sand made no sound when it fell, but 1,000 grains somehow did, even though 1,000 is just a single grain added enough times? Drop 1 grain of millet onto the floor. You hear nothing. The impact is too small. The sound it makes is below the threshold of anything your ears can detect. Now drop 1,000 grains at once. You hear a clear sound, a soft but definite impact. But here is the problem. If 1 grain makes no sound, then 2 grains should make no sound, because 2 is just 1 plus 1, and 1 makes nothing. And 3 should make no sound for the same reason, and 4, and so on. If you follow that logic all the way to 1,000, you should still hear nothing, because nothing added to nothing never becomes something. And yet you hear it. This is one of Zeno's lesser-known paradoxes, and it points at something genuinely strange about how quantities accumulate into qualities. At what exact point does inaudible become audible? There is no single grain you can point to and say, this one crossed the line. But somewhere in the accumulation something changed. The same question runs through color. At what wavelength does red become orange? Through temperature. At what exact degree does warm become hot? Through consciousness. At what point does a collection of neurons firing become an experience of something? The grain of millet is a small question about sound, but the shape of the problem is everywhere. Level 45, the paradox of the knower. What if knowing something in advance made it impossible to know at all? Imagine you are told you will be surprised by some piece of information tomorrow. You do not know what it is. You wait. Tomorrow arrives and the information is revealed, and you are genuinely surprised. But now imagine you are told the exact content of the surprising information today. You now know what you will learn tomorrow. When tomorrow comes and the information is revealed, you are not surprised. The prediction was accurate, but the knowledge destroyed the very thing it described. Some things can only exist if they are unknown. A surprise that is known in advance is no longer a surprise. A secret that is shared is no longer a secret. A spontaneous decision that is predicted is no longer spontaneous. This creates a strange class of facts, true statements that become false the moment they are known. The statement "you will be surprised tomorrow" was true, but knowing it made it false. Philosophers call these self-defeating propositions, and they reveal that knowledge is not always neutral. Sometimes the act of knowing a fact changes the fact. The observer and the observed are not always separate. This connects to something in quantum mechanics where measuring a particle changes its state, but it also connects to something much more everyday. There are things about yourself and your future that you might be better off not knowing. Not because the knowledge is wrong, but because knowing it would make it stop being true. Level 46, the Catch-22, Paradox. What if the only way to escape a situation was to already be out of it? A soldier wants to be declared mentally unfit for combat and sent home. The rule is simple. Any soldier who is insane can be grounded. All they have to do is ask. But there is a catch. The act of asking to be grounded proves that the soldier understands the danger they are in and wants to avoid it. And wanting to avoid danger is a completely rational response, which means the soldier who asks to be grounded is demonstrating sanity, which means they cannot be grounded. The only soldiers who could be declared insane are the ones who never ask. But those soldiers never get grounded because they never ask. The system has no exit. Every path through it leads back to where you started. Joseph Heller named this structure Catch-22, and the name stuck because the pattern is everywhere. You need experience to get a job, but you need a job to get experience. You need credit to borrow money, but you need borrowed money to build credit. You need to already be well to afford the healthcare that would make you well. The paradox is not in any single rule. It is in the relationship between rules. Two perfectly reasonable conditions that together create a wall with no door. The system is not broken. The system is working exactly as designed, and that is the most uncomfortable part. Level 47, the Paradox of Fiction. What if you genuinely felt grief for someone who never existed, and that grief was completely real? A character in a book dies. You feel sad. Not a mild intellectual acknowledgement of the narrative, but actual sadness. A feeling in your chest. Maybe you stop reading for a moment. Maybe you think about the character later. Maybe something about the loss stays with you for days. But the character was never real. They had no consciousness, no life to lose, nothing that could actually suffer or be missed. The grief has no real object. And yet, the grief is real. The feeling is real. The emotional experience is happening in a real brain, responding to real words. The sadness is not pretend. This creates a paradox at the heart of how humans engage with stories. We feel genuine emotions for entities we know do not exist. We mourn people who never lived. We fear for characters in situations that never happened. And somehow, this is completely normal. Some philosophers argue we do not really believe that characters are real during the experience of reading, but we are simulating the belief just enough for the emotions to fire. Others say the emotions are directed not at the character, but at the type of situation the character represents. You are not sad about the fictional death, but about what that kind of loss means in general. Others simply say the brain does not require reality to generate emotion. A sufficiently vivid representation is enough. And what that says about the relationship between feeling and reality is something worth sitting with for a while. Level 48, Quantum Suicide. What if from your own point of view you could never die? The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics says that every time a quantum event can go multiple ways, reality splits. Both outcomes happen in separate branches. You experience one branch, another version of you experiences the other. Now imagine a machine that will end your life if a quantum particle decays. There is a 50% chance of decay each second. The machine activates and nothing happens. You survive. The machine activates again. You survive. Again, again, again. From the outside, a third party sees you die on some attempt. That branch exists. That version of you is gone. But from your own point of view, you only ever experience the branches where you survive. Every time the machine should have ended things, reality split, and you continued in the branch where it did not. Over enough attempts, you have survived what should have been certain death many times over. If the many worlds interpretation is correct, and if consciousness follows only the surviving branch, then from a first-person perspective, death may be impossible. You would always find yourself in the branch where you continued. This is not a comforting idea. It says nothing about the quality of the branches where you survive. Only that you will always be in one of them. The version of you that lives through increasingly improbable circumstances might not be living well, and everyone else would just see you die normally. The immortality is entirely private and entirely unverifiable. Level 49, the problem of the Criterion. What if you needed to know what knowledge is before you could identify any knowledge, but you needed to identify knowledge before you could know what knowledge is? To sort true beliefs from false ones, you need a method. A standard, some criterion for what counts as knowing something versus just believing it. But how do you choose the right criterion? you would need to evaluate different possible criteria and decide which one is most reliable, which means you would need to already know which kinds of things count as reliable, which means you already need a criterion. You cannot choose a criterion for knowledge without already using one, and you cannot justify the one you are already using without appealing to itself, which is circular. Philosopher Roderick Chisholm called this the problem of the criterion and said it leads to only two uncomfortable options. The first is methodism. You start with a method for identifying knowledge, and then figure out what you know from there. But the method has to come from somewhere, and its own justification loops back on itself. The second is particularism. You start with specific things you are confident you know, and then figure out what method they imply. But this means your theory of knowledge is built on assumptions you made before you had a theory. There is no neutral starting point. Every attempt to ground knowledge in something solid turns out to be standing on something that also needs grounding. We are all reasoning our way outward from a center we chose before we knew how to choose. Level 50. The paradox of the heap of infinities. What if some infinities were bigger than others and the difference between them was itself infinite? This sounds like it should not make sense. Infinity means without end. How can one endless thing be larger than another endless thing? But mathematician Georg Cantor proved that it can. And the proof is surprisingly simple. Take the set of all natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, going on forever. Now take the set of all real numbers, every decimal, every fraction, every irrational number like pi. Between 0 and 1 alone there are infinitely many. Cantor showed that no matter how you try to match natural numbers to real numbers, you will always miss some real numbers. The real numbers cannot be listed. The natural numbers can. So the infinity of real numbers is strictly larger than the infinity of natural numbers. There are infinitely many sizes of infinity, each one larger than the last, and the gaps between them are themselves infinite. This destroyed several comfortable assumptions about mathematics. Infinity had always been treated as one thing, a ceiling, the biggest possible quantity. Cantor showed it was not a ceiling at all, but an endless tower of increasingly vast quantities, each one making the one below it look almost finite by comparison. Some of his contemporaries thought this was madness. One called it a disease from which mathematics would one day recover. It did not recover. Cantor was right, and the tower of infinities is still there, waiting for anyone who looks up long enough to start feeling genuinely small. Level 51. The Paradox of the Liar. Strengthened. What if fixing the liar paradox made it worse? Philosophers tried to solve the original liar paradox by creating a new category. Instead of just true and false, they added a third option, neither. A statement like this statement is false is neither true nor false. It simply does not have a truth value. Problem solved. But then someone wrote a new sentence. This statement is not true. If the statement is neither true nor false, then it is not true, which means what it says is correct, which means it is true. But if it is true, then it has a truth value and the neither category does not apply. So it must be either true or false. But if it is true, then it says it is not true, which makes it false. And if it is false, then it is not true, which makes it false. And if it is false, then it is not true, which makes what it says correct, which makes it true. The fix created the same problem it was trying to solve. Every attempt to patch the liar paradox produces a stronger version that survives the patch. Philosophers call this the strengthened liar, and it has resisted every proposed solution for over a century. Some logicians now believe the paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a fundamental feature of any sufficiently expressive language. Any system powerful enough to talk about its own statements will be able to produce sentences that break the system. Language contains the seeds of its own contradictions, and no amount of new categories changes that. Level 52. The Paradox of Buridan's Bridge. What if a promise could only be kept by breaking it? A man wants to cross a bridge. The bridge owner says, "I will let you cross if and only if the first thing you say when you reach the other side is true. If the first thing you say is false, I will throw you off the bridge." The man agrees and crosses. When he reaches the other side, he says, "You will throw me off this bridge." Now the bridge owner is stuck. If he throws the man off, then what the man said was true. But the deal was to throw him off only if he said something false. Since what he said was true, the man should be allowed to pass. But if the man is allowed to pass, then what he said was false, because he said he would be thrown off. And if what he said was false, the man should be thrown off. Every action makes itself wrong. The bridge owner cannot fulfill the terms of his own agreement. This is a variation on the liar paradox embedded in a contract. And what makes it more than a puzzle is that it shows how self-referential conditions in agreements produce genuine legal and logical impossibilities. The moment a contract references the outcome of itself as a condition for itself, the contract becomes unfulfillable. Real contracts occasionally do this by accident. Courts have to make decisions anyway, which means at some point the law just picks a side and calls it done regardless of the logic. Level 53. The Paradox of the Unexpected Gift. What if knowing a surprise was coming guaranteed it could not come? Someone tells you they will give you a surprise gift sometime this week. You will not know which day until it arrives. The moment you hear this, you start reasoning. If the gift has not arrived by Friday, it must come Friday. But then you would know it was coming Friday morning. That is not a surprise, so it cannot come Friday. With Friday eliminated, if the gift has not come by Thursday, it must come Thursday. But again, you would know. Not a surprise. Thursday eliminated. The same logic removes Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday. The surprise gift cannot exist. Knowing it is coming destroys the surprise completely. And then on Wednesday morning, someone knocks on your door with a gift and you are completely caught off guard. This is a cousin of the unexpected hanging, and it carries the same strange resolution. The logical elimination of every possibility does not actually prevent reality from doing what it was going to do. Your reasoning was sound, but it assumed that knowing the surprise was impossible would make it impossible. And that assumption was wrong. There is a gap between what logic concludes and what reality does. And surprises live in that gap. Maybe that is why life keeps surprising people who were sure they had figured everything out. Level 54. Simpson's Paradox. What if a medical treatment was better in every single group tested, but worse overall? A new drug is tested on two groups of patients, mild cases and severe cases. In mild cases, the new drug has a higher recovery rate than the old one. In every subgroup, the new drug wins. But when you combine all the data, the old drug has a higher overall recovery rate. How is that possible? The answer is in the proportions. The hospital testing the new drug happened to treat more severe cases than the hospital testing the old drug. Severe cases have lower recovery rates regardless of which drug is used. So the new drug's numbers get pulled down by the weight of all those severe cases, even though it outperformed the old drug within each severity level. The overall number is technically accurate and completely misleading. Simpson's paradox appears in sports statistics. A batter can have a higher average than another in every single month of the season, and still have a lower average for the whole year. It appears in university admissions data. A university can admit a higher percentage of applicants from every demographic group and still appear to discriminate overall. It is a reminder that numbers do not lie, but they do not tell the truth automatically either. The story a number tells depends entirely on how the groups were formed. And the groups are almost always chosen by someone with a reason for choosing them that way. Level 55. The Paradox of the Crocodile. What if a logical deal guaranteed the wrong outcome no matter what? A crocodile snatches a child from a riverbank. The desperate parent begs for the child's return. The crocodile, being unusually philosophical, makes a deal. I will return your child if and only if you correctly predict what I will do. The parent thinks carefully and says, you will not return my child. The crocodile is immediately stuck. If the prediction is correct, then the parent predicted correctly, and the crocodile must return the child. But if the crocodile returns the child, then the prediction was wrong, because the parent said the child would not be returned. If the prediction is wrong, then the crocodile does not have to return the child, but then the prediction was actually correct, because the parent said the child would not be returned. Which means the crocodile must return the child. Every path contradicts itself. The crocodile cannot return the child without making the deal impossible to fulfill. Cannot keep the child without making the deal impossible to fulfill. The agreement created a situation with no valid resolution. This is a version of the liar paradox embedded in a real-world scenario. And what it shows is that self-referential conditions in promises and contracts are not just logically tricky, they are genuinely unfulfillable. The deal was broken the moment it was made. Not because of bad faith,
but because of the structure of the language used to make it. Words can commit you to something no action can deliver. Level 56, the Paradox of Thrift. What if every individual in an economy making the smartest financial decision caused the entire economy to collapse? A recession begins. People are worried. The rational response is to save money, spend less, build up reserves, protect yourself against uncertainty. Every financial advisor would tell you the same thing: save more. But if everyone saves more at the same time, then everyone is spending less, and spending is what keeps businesses running. So businesses start losing revenue. They cut jobs. Unemployment rises. People have less income. They save even more out of fear, which causes more businesses to fail, which causes more unemployment. The individually rational decision to save produces a collectively catastrophic outcome. Everyone doing the right thing for themselves makes things worse for everyone, including themselves. John Maynard Keynes identified this in the 1930s during the Great Depression. He called it the Paradox of Thrift, and argued that during downturns governments needed to spend even when individuals were saving, because someone in the system had to keep money moving or the whole thing seized up. The paradox reveals that economics does not behave like a simple sum of individual choices. What is rational for one person can be ruinous when every person does it at once. The system has properties that none of its individual parts have, and no individual person can solve this by making better decisions. The problem is in the structure, not in the choices. Level 57, the Mere Addition Paradox. What if adding more happy people to the world could make the world morally worse? Imagine a world with a small population where everyone lives an extremely good life. High quality of experience, deep meaning, genuine flourishing. Now imagine adding a large number of new people whose lives are also good but noticeably less so. Still worth living, just not as rich or full as the original group. The total amount of happiness in the world is increased. There are more people experiencing good lives. By any measure that counts total well-being, the second world looks better. But most people feel strongly that the second world is actually worse, or at the very least not obviously better, because something about the quality of individual lives seems to matter beyond just the total sum. Now repeat the process. Add more people with slightly lower but still good lives. And again, each step seems like a small and acceptable change, but follow it far enough and you arrive at a world with an enormous population of people whose lives are just barely worth living. Philosopher Derek Parfit called the conclusion of this chain the repugnant conclusion, that a world of billions experiencing the bare minimum of positive experience could be considered better than a smaller world of people living extraordinarily well, because the total adds up higher. Something has gone wrong somewhere in the reasoning, but finding exactly where is much harder than it looks. Level 58, Fitch's Paradox of Knowability. What if the simple idea that all truths can be known led directly to the conclusion that all truths are already known? Start with a reasonable sounding principle. If something is true, then it is at least possible for someone to know it. There are no truths that are in principle forever unknowable. Everything true could in theory be discovered. That seems modest enough. It leaves room for things we do not currently know. It just says nothing is permanently beyond reach. But logician Frederick Fitch proved in 1963 that this principle leads somewhere unexpected. If all truths are knowable, then all truths are actually known, not just potentially knowable, already known. The proof is subtle, but the shape of it is this. Suppose there is a truth that nobody knows. Call it an unknown truth. Now the statement "this truth is unknown" is itself a truth, and by our principle it must be knowable. But the moment someone knows it, they know the truth, and they know it is known, which means it is no longer an unknown truth, which means the statement "this truth is unknown" is now false, which means you cannot actually know an unknown truth without destroying what made it an unknown truth. So either the statement cannot be known, which violates the principle, or it was never a truth in the first place. Either way, the principle that all truths are knowable quietly collapses into the claim that all truths are known, and that is clearly false. The gap between what could be known and what is known turns out to be harder to define than anyone expected. Level 59, the Paradox of Teleportation. What if every time you used a teleporter, you died and were replaced by a perfect copy that thought it was you? Imagine a teleportation machine that works by scanning your body completely. Every atom, every connection, every memory, every neural pattern. Then it destroys the original and transmits the information to the destination where a new body is assembled from different matter that is arranged in exactly the same way. From the outside, it looks like teleportation. You disappear here and appear there. But from the inside, something strange might be happening. The original you was destroyed. The thing that arrived at the destination is made of different atoms arranged identically. It has all your memories. It is convinced it is you. But is it? If personal identity depends on physical continuity, then the original you died and someone else with your memories woke up at the destination. Every teleporter trip is a death followed by a resurrection of someone who believes they survived. If personal identity depends on psychological continuity, then the copy is you, because it has everything that made you you. The specific atoms were never the point. The paradox has no agreed resolution, and it matters more than it might seem, because your body already replaces its atoms constantly over years. The question of whether the teleporter kills you is really the question of what you are, and that question turns out to be harder than anyone expected. Level 60, the Paradox of the Infinite Library. What if a library contained every possible book, and finding the truth inside it was impossible? Jorge Luis Borges imagined a library containing every possible combination of letters, spaces, and punctuation marks arranged into books of a fixed length. Every book that has ever been written is in there. Every book that will ever be written. Every book that could ever be written, including the one with the true history of your life in complete detail, including the cure for every disease, including the exact date and cause of your death, including the complete correct theory of everything, but also including a version of each of those books with one letter wrong, and another with 2 letters wrong, and a trillion versions where the errors are scattered randomly through the text in ways that make them look exactly like the correct version. For every true book in the library, there are effectively infinite false ones that are indistinguishable without already knowing the truth. The library contains all knowledge, and it is completely useless, because you cannot find what is true without already knowing what is true. The information is all there, perfectly preserved, totally inaccessible. This is not just a thought experiment about libraries. It is a description of the universe. All the information you could ever need exists somewhere in reality. The problem has never been that the truth is hidden. The problem is that truth and falsehood look exactly the same until you already know the difference. Level 61, the Paradox of Self-Knowledge. What if the one thing you could never fully understand was yourself? You can study physics and eventually understand how stars form. You can study history and eventually understand why empires fell. You can study other people and eventually build a reasonable model of how they think and why they behave the way they do. But when you turn that same attention on yourself, something strange happens. The thing doing the observing is the same as the thing being observed. Your mind is trying to understand your mind using your mind. And every conclusion it reaches is produced by the very processes it is trying to examine. You cannot step outside yourself to check whether your self-model is accurate. You cannot verify your own biases from a neutral position because there is no neutral position available to you. Every thought you have about yourself is shaped by the psychology you are trying to see clearly. This does not mean self-knowledge is impossible. You can learn things about yourself. Therapy works. Reflection works. Feedback from others works. But there is always a layer you cannot reach. Always a blind spot that exists specifically because you are the one looking. The philosopher who most thoroughly examined the limits of self-knowledge was perhaps Socrates, and what he concluded was that the beginning of wisdom was acknowledging how little you actually know about yourself. Most people never get that far. They carry a confident self-image assembled from selected memories and convenient interpretations and call it self-knowledge. It is a comfortable story, just not a complete one. Level 62, Maxwell's Demon. What if a tiny intelligent being could violate the laws of physics just by paying attention? The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy always increases in a closed system. Disorder grows. Heat flows from hot to cold. Things spread out and mix.
and do not spontaneously separate themselves. This is one of the most ironclad laws in physics, but James Clerk Maxwell imagined a demon, a tiny intelligent creature sitting at a door between two chambers of gas. Every time a fast-moving molecule approached from the left, the demon opened the door and let it through to the right. Every time a slow-moving molecule approached from the right, the demon opened the door and let it through to the left. Over time, the right side gets hotter and the left side gets colder. A temperature difference appears from nowhere. Order emerges from disorder. The second law appears to be broken, and the demon did it just by watching and opening a door. The resolution took decades to find. The demon has to store information about the molecules it is tracking, and when its memory fills up, it has to erase information. Erasing information generates heat. The entropy produced by the demon's bookkeeping is always at least as large as the entropy it reduced in the gas. The law holds, but only because information itself turned out to be physical. Storing and erasing information costs energy. Knowing things about the world is not free. The demon taught us that information is not abstract, it is part of the universe, and the universe charges you for it. Level 63. The Paradox of Quantum Entanglement. What if two particles on opposite sides of the universe were so connected that measuring one instantly determined the state of the other, with no signal passing between them? This is quantum entanglement, and it is real. It has been confirmed in laboratories repeatedly. Two particles are created together in a linked state. They are separated by any distance. When one is measured and found to be spinning in one direction, the other is instantly found to be spinning in the opposite direction. Not after a delay. Instantly. Einstein hated this. He called it spooky action at a distance and spent years trying to prove it could not work the way it seemed to. He believed there must be hidden information carried by the particles that predetermined the outcome. Like a pair of gloves separated into two boxes. When you open one and find a left glove, you instantly know the other box contains a right glove. No mystery. But experiments in the 1960s and after showed that Einstein was wrong. The particles do not carry hidden information. The correlation is real, and it cannot be explained by anything traveling between them. Nothing travels faster than light. Information cannot be sent this way. The entanglement cannot be used to communicate, and yet the connection is there. What it means is still argued about. Some say it means reality is non-local, that space does not actually separate things the way it appears to. Some say it means the particles were never really separate to begin with. Some say it reveals that our concept of individual particles is the illusion and the underlying reality is one connected whole. The math works perfectly. The interpretation is still up for debate. And the debate is about as fundamental as debates get. Level 64. The Paradox of Determinism and Moral Responsibility. What if nobody had ever done anything wrong because nobody had ever really chosen to do anything at all? If determinism is true, then every action every person has ever taken was the inevitable result of prior causes stretching back before they were born. The neurons that fired when someone made a choice fired because of prior states of the brain. Those states were caused by earlier states, those by genetics and environment and experience, none of which were chosen. So if a person commits a terrible act, the chain of causes that produced that act began long before that person existed. They were born into a body with a particular nervous system, into a world with particular conditions, and what happened was the result of all of that. Does that mean they are not responsible? Our entire system of justice is built on the assumption that people make real choices and can be held accountable for them. But if choices are just the inevitable output of prior causes, then punishment looks less like justice and more like blaming a calculator for the answer it produced. Compatibilists argue that responsibility does not require the ability to have done otherwise. That acting from your own desires and reasoning counts as freedom even if those desires were themselves caused. That is enough for moral responsibility to make sense. Hard determinists say that is not enough, that real responsibility requires real alternatives and determinism removes them. Nobody has resolved this, and it matters enormously. Every courtroom, every punishment, every moment of guilt or pride rests on an assumption that may not hold. Level 65. The Ellsberg Paradox. What if people consistently made choices that violated the rules of rational decision-making and did it on purpose? You are offered a bet. An urn contains 90 balls, 30 are red. The remaining 60 are some mix of black and yellow, but you do not know the exact split. You can bet on red or on black. Most people choose red. The probability of drawing red is known exactly, 1 in 3. The probability of drawing black is unknown. It could be anywhere from 0 to 2/3. People prefer the known risk to the unknown one. Now you are offered a second bet on red or yellow versus black or yellow. Now most people switch and choose black or yellow. But that is inconsistent. If you preferred red to black because red was certain, then you should prefer red or yellow to black or yellow for the same reason. The logic that made you choose red the first time should make you choose the other option the second time. But it does not. Economist Daniel Ellsberg showed in 1961 that people are not just risk-averse, they are ambiguity-averse. They dislike unknown probabilities even more than bad known ones, and this preference is so strong it causes people to make choices that contradict themselves when the same bet is framed differently. This matters far beyond gambling, investment decisions, medical choices, policy decisions under uncertainty. All of them are affected by the same irrational preference for the familiar risk over the unknown one. We are not as rational as we think we are, and the gap between how we think we decide and how we actually decide is larger than most people are comfortable admitting. Level 66, the Banach-Tarski Paradox. What if you could take a single ball and turn it into 2 identical balls the same size as the original without adding any material? Mathematically you can. The Banach-Tarski theorem proves that a solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces and reassembled into 2 spheres identical to the original. No stretching, no adding material, just decomposing and rearranging. This does not work with physical objects. Atoms cannot be divided infinitely, and matter is not made of the kind of abstract points that the theorem uses. But in the mathematics of pure geometry, with sets of points that have no size, the proof is valid. The pieces involved are not ordinary shapes. They are non-measurable sets, collections of points so geometrically bizarre that you cannot assign them a volume. They exist mathematically, but they cannot be constructed physically. They are infinite in their complexity, in a way no physical knife could ever cut. What the theorem actually reveals is something about the axiom of choice, a foundational assumption in mathematics that allows you to make infinitely many selections from sets simultaneously without specifying how. The Banach-Tarski paradox follows logically from this axiom, which means either the axiom is wrong or mathematics allows objects to duplicate. Most mathematicians accept the axiom and accept the paradox as a consequence. They say it shows that infinity behaves in ways that have no physical analog, and that is fine. But it is a strange kind of fine. A theorem that lets you clone spheres is not something you can just walk past without looking twice. Level 67, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. What if mathematics itself could not prove that mathematics was consistent? In 1931, Kurt Gödel published a proof that shook the foundations of logic and has never stopped shaking them. He showed that in any mathematical system powerful enough to describe basic arithmetic, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Not statements that are hard to prove, statements that are genuinely true and genuinely unprovable. The system is too limited to reach them, even though they are true. The proof works by constructing a mathematical statement that essentially says this statement cannot be proven. If the statement is false, then it can be proven, which means the system proves false things, which means the system is broken. If the statement is true, then it cannot be proven, which means the system has true things it cannot reach. Either way, the system is incomplete. There are truths outside its grasp. And then Gödel proves something even more unsettling. No consistent mathematical system can prove its own consistency, which means we cannot use mathematics to verify that mathematics does not contain hidden contradictions. We have to trust it from the outside, without being able to check. This destroyed a dream that mathematicians had held for decades, the dream of a complete and perfectly verified foundation for all of mathematics. Gödel showed it was impossible in principle, not just in practice. The most powerful tool humans have ever built for understanding reality turns out to have permanent blind spots built into its foundations, and there is no way to remove them. Level 68. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. What if the universe had a fundamental limit on how much could ever be known about it? And that limit was not a failure of our instruments, but a feature of reality itself. Werner Heisenberg discovered that you cannot simultaneously know the exact position and the exact momentum of a particle. The more precisely you measure one, the less precisely you can know the other. Not because of clumsy measuring tools, because of the nature of particles themselves. A particle's position and momentum are not two separate things that both exist with precision simultaneously. They are complementary properties that exist in a kind of irreducible blur. Measuring one sharpens it at the cost of smearing the other. This is not a limitation of human technology. It is a limitation built into physics. There is no better instrument you could build, no more careful experiment you could run. The uncertainty is not in the measurement, it is in the particle. What this means is that, at the most fundamental level, reality is not fully determined. There are facts about the universe that do not exist until they are measured. Before measurement, there are only probabilities, a cloud of possible states. Classical physics imagined a universe where everything had a precise state at every moment, and we just needed better tools to see it. Quantum mechanics says no, the precise state does not exist. The universe itself holds its cards until the moment they are forced into a specific value by measurement. And what is doing the forcing is still one of the most contested questions in all of physics. Level 69, the paradox of the fine-tuned universe. What if the universe was so precisely calibrated for life that the probability of it happening by chance was effectively zero? And yet here we are, the fundamental constants of physics, the strength of gravity, the charge of an electron, the mass of a proton, the cosmological constant that governs the expansion of space. All of these have precise values, and if any of them were even slightly different, the universe would not contain stars or planets or atoms or anything complex at all. If gravity were slightly stronger, stars would burn out too quickly for life to develop. If it were slightly weaker, matter would never coalesce into stars at all. If the cosmological constant was slightly larger, the universe would have expanded too fast for galaxies to form. If it was slightly smaller, the universe would have collapsed back on itself. The numbers are tuned to allow complexity to exist, and the precision required is extraordinary. 3 explanations are offered, and none of them are comfortable. The first is luck. The constants are what they are, and we happen to be in a universe where they support life. We would not be here to notice if they did not. The second is a multiverse. There are an enormous number of universes, each with different constants. We live in one of the rare ones that allows our kind of complexity, not because it was designed for us, but because we could only exist in one like this. The third is design. The constants are what they are, because someone set them that way. Physics cannot distinguish between these 3. Each is consistent with the evidence, and each has implications that extend far beyond physics. Level 70, the paradox of the observer. What if looking at something changed what it was? In the famous double-slit experiment, a beam of particles is fired at a barrier with 2 slits. When no one is measuring which slit each particle passes through, the particles behave like waves. They create an interference pattern on the screen behind the barrier, as if each particle passed through both slits at once. But when a detector is placed to measure which slit each particle goes through, something changes. The interference pattern disappears. The particles behave like particles. Each one goes through one slit and hits the screen in a pattern that matches single particles, not waves. The act of measuring which slit the particle went through changed how the particle behaved, not by physically interfering with it. The detectors were designed to be as non-intrusive as possible. The change happened because measurement occurred. This is one of the most replicated and most disturbing results in all of science. Observation affects the thing observed at the quantum level. Reality at its smallest scale appears to be sensitive to whether it is being watched. The interpretations range from the practical to the philosophical. Some say it just means quantum systems are described by wave functions that collapse when interacted with. Some say it means consciousness plays a role in collapsing reality into definite states. Some say it reveals that particles do not have definite properties until they are forced to by measurement. What no one disputes is the result. When you look, the behavior changes. And what that means about the nature of reality when no one is looking is a question physics has not answered. Level 71. The paradox of personal identity. What if you are not the same person you were 10 years ago in any meaningful sense, and the feeling of continuity is just a story your brain tells to hold things together? Your body has replaced most of its atoms. Your beliefs have changed. Your memories have been edited and reconstructed so many times they barely resemble the original experiences. Your personality has shifted. The things you care about are different. The fears you had then may be gone, and new ones have appeared. So what makes you you? What is the thread that connects the child in your earliest memory to the person lying here right now?
Philosopher Derek Parfit spent his career on this question and arrived somewhere surprising. He concluded that personal identity is not what matters. What matters is psychological continuity, the overlapping chain of memories, beliefs, intentions, and personality traits that connect earlier and later versions of a person. But here is what makes that unsettling. Psychological continuity is a matter of degree, not an all or nothing thing. You are more continuous with yourself from yesterday than from 20 years ago. There is no sharp line, no moment where you definitively became a different person or definitively remained the same one. The self is not a thing, it is a process. A river that looks like it stays the same while the water is always different. And the feeling that there is a stable you at the center of all of it is not evidence that there is. It is just what a process that feels like a self would feel like from the inside. Level 72. The Paradox of Quantum Immortality. What if, from your own subjective point of view, you could never experience death no matter what happened to you? The many worlds interpretation says that every quantum event that could go multiple ways actually goes all ways simultaneously. In branching universes, every possible outcome happens somewhere. The universe splits, and both versions continue. Now apply this to survival. Every moment there are tiny quantum events happening in your body and brain that could go slightly differently. In some branches you survive a little longer. In others, you do not. From the outside, a third party watches probabilities play out normally. Sometimes you survive. Eventually you do not. But from the inside, you can only ever experience the branches where you survive. Every branch where you do not is simply a branch where your experience ends, and you are no longer present to observe anything. The branches where you died are inaccessible to you not because they did not happen, but because there is no you left in them to have the experience. Over a long enough time scale, a version of you would survive increasingly improbable events, not because reality is protecting you, but because the branches where you die simply stop containing your perspective. This does not mean those branches are not real. People who love you would experience your death in those branches. Those versions of them would grieve normally. The immortality, if it exists, is entirely private, entirely unverifiable, and it says nothing about the quality of the branches where survival keeps happening. Level 73. The Paradox of the Watched Pot. What if paying close attention to something made it take longer to happen? You are waiting for water to boil. You watch it. It seems to take forever. You look away and deal with something else, and when you check again, it is boiling. The watched pot really does seem slower. This is partly psychology. When you focus on something, time feels slower because you are processing more consciously. But at the quantum level, something stranger is happening. The quantum Zeno effect shows that repeatedly measuring an unstable quantum system can actually freeze it in its current state. An atom that would decay within a certain time can be prevented from decaying simply by being measured frequently enough. Each measurement collapses the wave function back to its initial state before it has had time to evolve toward decay. The more you look, the less it changes. This has been confirmed experimentally. Scientists have slowed and in some cases essentially stopped quantum transitions by increasing the rate of observation. The act of looking does not just passively record what is happening, it actively intervenes in what happens next. At the quantum level, attention is not neutral. It is a force. It pushes reality back toward where it started. And the universe responds to being watched by behaving differently than it would if no one were watching. The watched pot is not superstition. It is physics. Level 74. The Paradox of the Preacher and the Pragmatist. What if doing the right thing required pretending to believe something you knew was not certain? A doctor knows that a patient's recovery depends heavily on belief. Patients who believe they will recover do better. The placebo effect is real and measurable. A confident prognosis from a trusted doctor genuinely improves outcomes, but the doctor does not know if the patient will recover. Medicine is probabilistic. The honest answer is there is a reasonable chance you will be fine, but I cannot promise anything. If the doctor says that the patient may lose confidence and their recovery may be worse, if the doctor says you are going to be fine knowing they cannot be certain, they are not being fully honest. The doctor who overstates certainty improves outcomes. The doctor who tells the complete truth may worsen them. This is not just a medical problem. Teachers who tell students they have potential sometimes create the potential that did not exist before.
Leaders who project certainty in uncertain situations sometimes produce the outcomes they claimed were inevitable. Parents who tell children they can do things they are not yet sure they can do sometimes make those things possible. Honesty about uncertainty can be its own kind of harm, and useful belief sometimes has to be maintained in the face of incomplete evidence. The paradox is not whether to lie, it is whether there is a version of truth that includes warranted confidence in uncertain outcomes, and whether the person who provides that confidence is deceiving others or doing something more complicated and more necessary than that. Level 75. The Paradox of Polanyi. What if you knew far more than you could ever say? Scientist and philosopher Michael Polanyi noticed something strange about human knowledge. We can ride a bicycle without being able to explain the physics of balance. We can recognize a face in a crowd without being able to describe what makes it recognizable. We can sense that a scientific theory feels wrong before we can articulate why. We know things we cannot put into words. Polanyi called this tacit knowledge, the vast layer of understanding that underlies everything we do but resists being made explicit. When you learn to ride a bike, nobody gives you a formula. You just fall enough times that your body figures something out and stores it somewhere language cannot reach. This creates a paradox for how we think about knowledge itself. If knowledge is only what can be stated and verified and shared, then most of what makes skilled humans skilled is not knowledge at all. The master craftsman, the experienced doctor, the great teacher, all of them know things that cannot be fully transferred through instruction. And if you cannot fully transfer it, you cannot fully examine it. You cannot check it for errors in the normal way. The knowledge that guides the most important human judgments is precisely the knowledge that is hardest to inspect. We are always operating on more than we know, and the gap between what we can say and what we actually understand is where most of the important things happen. Level 76. The Paradox of Free Speech. What if the strongest defense of free speech eventually produced arguments for limiting it? Free speech is defended on the grounds that open debate allows good ideas to defeat bad ones. That sunlight is the best disinfectant. That even wrong or harmful speech is better left in the open, where it can be challenged, than driven underground where it cannot be seen. But the same freedom that allows this argument to be made also allows arguments against free speech to be made. Arguments that some speech causes measurable harm, that some ideas do not get defeated in open debate but spread and normalize and cause damage before they can be countered. That the playing field is not level and free speech in practice advantages those with the resources to speak loudly. If those arguments are correct and free speech should be limited, then free speech produced the conclusion that free speech should be limited. The principle undermined itself. If those arguments are wrong, then free speech allowed wrong ideas to circulate and be countered, which is exactly what it was supposed to do. The paradox is that you cannot evaluate the case for limiting speech without using the freedom to speak, and you cannot evaluate the case for unlimited speech without allowing arguments against it. The principle is the tool you use to examine the principle. There is no view from outside it. Every position on free speech is taken from within the space free speech creates. Level 77. The Paradox of the Infinite Series. What if adding numbers forever could produce a finite result, and that result was provably correct and obviously absurd at the same time? Take the series 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 going on forever. At any point in the series, the total is either 1 or 0 depending on where you stop. It never settles, it oscillates without converging. But if you try to calculate the sum of the infinite series mathematically using certain legitimate techniques, the answer comes out as 1/2. 1/2. Not 1, not 0. A value the series never actually reaches at any finite point. This is not a mistake. The result is consistent within the mathematical framework that produces it, but it is deeply strange. The series does not converge in the ordinary sense. The partial sums never approach 1/2. Yet 1/2 is the assigned sum of the infinite series within certain mathematical systems. There are even stranger results. The sum of all positive integers 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 going on forever has been assigned the value -1/12 in certain contexts in physics. String theory uses this result. It appears in calculations that match experimental observations. The infinite series paradox reveals that mathematics contains valid operations that produce results with no physical meaning in the obvious sense. Results that seem wrong, results that are somehow useful anyway. Mathematics is not just a description of reality, It is a system with its own internal rules that sometimes goes places reality cannot follow. Level 78. The Paradox of Consciousness. What if the one thing you are most certain of is the one thing science is least able to explain? You are certain you are conscious, that there is something it is like to be you right now, that your experience of this moment has a felt quality to it, not just information processing but actual experience, the redness of red, the feeling of a thought forming, the sense of being here. This is called qualia, and it is the hardest problem in all of science. We can explain how the brain processes information, how neurons fire, how signals travel and patterns form. We can build detailed maps of which brain regions activate during which experiences. We can correlate brain states with reported experiences very precisely. What we cannot explain is why any of that produces experience at all. Why does information processing feel like anything? A computer processes information. It does not feel anything as far as we know. Why should a biological computer be different? Philosopher David Chalmers called this the hard problem of consciousness and distinguished it from the easy problems. The easy problems are explaining how the brain does things. Those are hard in the scientific sense, but they are tractable. The hard problem is explaining why doing those things produces subjective experience. No one has solved it. Some argue that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality like mass or charge. Some argue that it is an illusion and there is actually no one home. Some argue that we simply lack the cognitive tools to understand it. What everyone agrees on is that you are the most familiar thing in the world to yourself and also the most mysterious. Level 79. The Paradox of the Eternal Return. What if this exact moment had already happened an infinite number of times and would happen an infinite number of times again? Friedrich Nietzsche proposed eternal recurrence, not as a cosmological claim, but as the heaviest possible question you could ask yourself. Imagine that the universe is finite in its possible states, and infinite in its duration. Then, by pure mathematics, every arrangement of matter must eventually repeat, and in an infinite future must repeat infinitely many times, which means this exact moment, these exact thoughts, this exact position in the dark, has happened before, will happen again, endlessly, with no variation. Nietzsche used this as a test. If you were told your life would repeat exactly forever with no changes, could you say yes to it? Could you want it to happen again? Could you love it enough to choose it infinitely? Most people cannot get there immediately. The regrets are too specific, the lost time too visible, the moments you wish had gone differently too present. But Nietzsche thought the attempt to get there was the point. Not achieving perfect acceptance, but using the idea as a mirror to see which parts of your life you could not affirm, and then changing those parts. It is a strange kind of motivation, imagining infinite repetition to find the courage to change. But maybe that is what it takes. The weight of eternity pressing down on a single ordinary moment until you finally decide to live it differently. Level 80. The Paradox of the Unexpected Winner. What if believing something strongly enough about the future was enough to make the opposite happen? An election is approaching. Every poll shows the same result. One candidate is far ahead. The other has no realistic path to victory. The data is consistent, and the gap is wide, and everyone who follows these things closely is confident in the outcome. And then election night arrives, and the trailing candidate wins. Not by a little, by a clear margin. The paradox is not just that predictions failed. Predictions fail all the time. The deeper problem is that the predictions may have caused their own failure. When voters believe a candidate cannot win, they change their behavior based on that belief. Some supporters of the losing candidate do not bother turning up because they assume it is already decided. Some supporters of the winning candidate relax for the same reason. Some undecided voters make a choice based on which direction they think the momentum is going. The prediction becomes an input into the very system it was trying to describe, and the system responds. This does not only happen in elections. A stock that everyone believes will rise attracts buyers until it is overpriced and then collapses. A restaurant that gets written up as the next big thing fills with people who were not really interested in the food and drives away the customers who were. A team everyone expects to win enters a game with less hunger than the team everyone expects to lose. What makes this a genuine paradox rather than just a case of bad forecasting is that the more accurate the prediction, the more disruptive it becomes. A perfect prediction about a human system would change that system enough to make itself wrong, and a prediction that nobody believes is not really a prediction at all.
Level 81. The Stockdale Paradox. What if surviving the worst possible circumstances required holding two beliefs that should not be able to coexist? Admiral James Stockdale was a prisoner of war for over 7 years, held in conditions designed to break a person completely. When he was eventually asked who did not make it out of that situation, his answer was not who you would expect. It was not the pessimists. It was the optimists. The ones who told themselves they would be out by Christmas, and then by Easter, and then by the next Christmas. Each failed deadline broke something in them a little more, until eventually there was nothing left to break. The people who survived held a stranger combination, an unshakable faith that they would prevail in the end, paired with a brutal acceptance of the most painful facts of their present reality. Not optimism, not pessimism, both at once, refusing to blend into either one. This sounds like it should not be possible to sustain. Faith in an outcome usually requires softening the facts that contradict it. Acceptance of brutal facts usually erodes the faith that things will turn out fine. Most people pick one and let it color the other, but the ones who survived did not let the faith distort the facts, and did not let the facts extinguish the faith. They were held separately, each one doing its job. The facts kept them prepared. The faith kept them moving. It turns out the mind can hold a contradiction indefinitely as long as both halves of it are doing real work. The danger is never the contradiction itself. It is collapsing into only one side of it. Level 82. The Paradox of the Arrow of Time. What if the laws of physics worked equally well in both directions of time, but only one direction ever actually happens? The fundamental equations of physics are time-symmetric. They work the same forwards and backwards. If you filmed a collision between two billiard balls and played the film in reverse, it would look completely physical. Nothing about the physics of the collision tells you which direction time is running. But film a glass falling off a table and shattering and play it in reverse, and you instantly know something is wrong. Shards do not leap off the floor and assemble themselves into a glass and fly up to the table. That never happens, even though the physics of each individual particle interaction involved would be perfectly valid in reverse. So where does the arrow of time come from? Why does the universe run in one direction when the laws that govern it have no preferred direction? The answer most physicists accept is entropy. The second law of thermodynamics says entropy increases, disorder grows. The glass shattering increases entropy. The shards reassembling would decrease it. And decreasing entropy is not impossible by the laws of physics, but it is astronomically improbable. The arrow of time is a statistical fact, not a fundamental law. The universe runs forwards because going forwards means going toward greater disorder, and there are vastly more disordered states than ordered ones. But this raises a deeper question. Why was entropy so low at the beginning? Why did the universe start in such an ordered state that it has been running downhill ever since? That is a question physics can describe but has not explained. Level 83. The Paradox of Moral Progress. What if moral progress was real, but the idea of moral progress required a standard that moral progress itself kept changing? We look back at the past and see practices that are now considered wrong. Slavery, the treatment of women as property, the casual cruelty toward groups now considered deserving of rights. We say those things were wrong even if people at the time did not recognize them as wrong. This implies there is a standard of morality that exists independently of what any given society believes at any given time. Otherwise, wrong just means not what we currently think, and moral progress is just change in preferences, not genuine improvement. But if there is a standard independent of any society's beliefs, then what is it, and where does it come from, and how do we access it? We cannot step outside our own moral framework to check our beliefs against the external standard. We can only compare our current beliefs to our past beliefs and call the direction of change progress, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. The people of the future may look back at practices we currently consider acceptable, the way we look back at slavery, and we would not know. We are inside our moral framework the way people in the past were inside theirs, convinced that we have gotten the important things right, unable to see the blind spot that later generations will find obvious. Moral progress seems real,
and we are probably not at the end of it. Level 84. The paradox of the simulation's edge. What if the simulation you might be living in had edges, and you were unknowingly approaching one? If the universe is a simulation, then it is running on some kind of computational substrate, and any computational substrate has limits. Processing power, memory, resolution, a point beyond which the simulation cannot go without either expanding its resources or simply not rendering what is not being observed. Some physicists have pointed out that our universe does seem to have resolution limits. At the Planck scale, space and time appear to become granular. Distances smaller than the Planck length may not be physically meaningful. Time intervals smaller than the Planck time may not exist.
This is exactly what you would expect from a simulation that renders reality at a fixed resolution. Not infinite detail everywhere, just enough detail at the scale where things are being observed. The paradox is that if there are edges to the simulation, they might be detectable, but the act of looking for them might cause the simulation to render them as something explainable. Every time you try to find the boundary recedes because the simulation generates a plausible physical explanation before you reach it. You could spend an eternity approaching the edge of reality, and the edge would always stay one step ahead, generating coherent physics to fill the space in front of you. Whether you are in a simulation or not, you would have exactly this experience. The universe always looks like it goes one level deeper than whatever you just examined. Level 85. The paradox of the last question. What if every answer to the biggest question just became a new version of the same question? Why does the universe exist rather than nothing? Because of the laws of physics. Why do the laws of physics exist? Because of no fundamental principles. Why do those principles exist? Every answer generates the same question one level up. The why keeps surviving no matter how deep you go. And there are only 3 places it can end. It ends in an infinite regress, causes all the way back without a first one, an eternal chain with no beginning and no ground. It ends in a circle, things that cause each other in a loop with no external foundation. Reality explains itself by going around. It ends in something that simply exists without reason, something that just is, a brute fact, the universe or God or mathematics or consciousness, or something else that requires no explanation because it is the thing that explanations bottom out in. None of these is satisfying. The infinite regress never gives you a foundation. The circle never gives you a reason outside itself. The brute fact asks you to accept something unexplained and call that an answer, and yet one of them must be true. There is no fourth option. The question of why anything exists is the question that every framework for understanding reality eventually hits, and cannot get past. It is probably the most important question anyone has ever asked, and it is the one question that may genuinely have no answer available to minds like ours. Level 86. The paradox of knowing you are dreaming. What if the moment you knew you were dreaming, the dream changed into something else? In a lucid dream, you become aware that you are dreaming while still inside the dream. You know the environment is not real. You know the people are constructs. You know the physical laws can be bent because you are the one generating them. But the moment that awareness arrives, the dream shifts. It becomes self-conscious. The spontaneous logic of the dream, the strange narrative connections that made emotional sense, begin to dissolve. The dream becomes a performance for the part of you that is watching. Something similar happens in waking life. When you become aware of a habit you are in the middle of, the habit changes. When you notice you are acting a certain way in a social situation, the natural flow of the behavior stops and becomes deliberate. When you observe yourself feeling something, the observation shifts the feeling. Consciousness examining itself changes what it finds, not because the examination is physically disruptive, but because awareness and unreflective experience cannot fully coexist. You cannot be completely inside something and completely outside it at the same time. The dream that knows it is a dream is already something other than a dream. The feeling you are analyzing is already something other than what it was before you started analyzing it. There is a version of yourself that exists only when no one is watching, even when the watcher is you. Level 87. The paradox of the open future. What if the future was genuinely open, and that openness was itself the reason planning was so difficult? A deterministic future is fixed. Every event is the necessary consequence of prior events.
Planning in a deterministic universe is just calculation. You figure out the chain of causes, and you know what will happen. But if the future is genuinely open, then no calculation can close it. Something can always happen that was not determined by prior causes. The future contains room for the genuinely new. This sounds like freedom, and it is. But it is also why planning fails. Not because planners are bad at calculating, but because a genuinely open future cannot be fully calculated. The thing that makes the future free is the same thing that makes it resistant to prediction. Every major plan ever made has been disrupted by something that was not in the plan. Not because of bad planning, but because the future keeps generating things that were not determined by the past. New information, new people, new combinations of forces that had never combined before. The more important a decision, the further into the future it reaches. And the further it reaches, the more open future it has to pass through. The more open future it has to pass through, the more likely it is to encounter something that was not in the plan. The paradox of the open future is that the thing that makes your choices meaningful is the same thing that makes your plans uncertain. You cannot have one without the other. Level 88. The paradox of language. What if the tool you used to think was also the thing that limited what you could think? Language is how you process and communicate ideas. You think in words. You reason in sentences. The structure of your language shapes what distinctions you can easily make and what relationships are easy to see. But language is also a cage. If your language has no word for a concept, the concept is harder to think. Not impossible, but harder. The shape of available vocabulary is the shape of easily available thought. Different languages carve the world up differently. Some have words for emotional states that have no equivalent in other languages. Some treat time differently in their grammar. Some have more words for spatial relationships, and speakers of those languages are better at certain spatial tasks. This suggests that the thoughts most natural to you are partly a function of the language you think in. The things that feel obviously true and the things that seem obviously false are filtered through a linguistic structure you did not choose. But here is the deeper problem. You cannot evaluate this limitation from outside it. You are using language to think about the limitations of language. Any thought you have about what language cannot capture is itself a thought shaped by language. The tool is examining itself with itself. This does not mean escape is impossible. Mathematics, music, direct experience, these are ways of knowing that partially bypass verbal language. But the moment you try to talk about what you found there, you are back inside the cage trying to describe what you saw while you were outside. Level 89. Wigner's friend. What if two people could each observe the exact same event, and one of them would be left with no defined reality at all, until someone else checked on them? A scientist named Wigner has a friend inside a sealed lab. Inside that lab, there is a particle in superposition, existing in multiple states at once. The friend measures the particle and gets a definite result. From the friend's perspective, the experiment is over. The superposition collapsed. There is one outcome. But Wigner is standing outside the lab. According to quantum mechanics, until he opens the door and looks, the entire contents of the lab, including the friend's measurement and the friend's memory of measuring it, are still in superposition. From Wigner's point of view, the friend has not actually seen a result yet. The whole sealed room exists in an undefined quantum blur. So which one is correct? The friend who is certain the measurement happened and produced a single outcome, or Wigner, who, by the rules of quantum mechanics, must treat the entire lab, including the friend, as undecided until he personally checks. If both descriptions are valid, then reality itself depends on who is doing the observing. The friend experienced a definite world. Wigner is standing outside a world that has not yet become definite. Both of these are true at the same time from their respective positions. Some physicists try to resolve this by saying both outcomes happen in separate branches that eventually reconnect. Others say it shows that quantum states represent knowledge rather than objective fact. Nobody has settled it. What is left is the uncomfortable possibility that reality is not the same thing for everyone observing it from a different vantage point, and there may be no neutral place to stand and ask which version is the real one. Level 90. The Paradox of the Sleeping Beauty. What if the answer to a simple probability question depended entirely on who you were and when you were asking?
Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If it lands heads, she will be woken once on Monday, and the experiment ends. If it lands tails, she will be woken on Monday, and again on Tuesday with her memory of the Monday awakening erased, so both awakenings feel identical to her. When she wakes up, she is asked what probability she assigns to the coin having landed heads. One camp says 1/2. The coin was fair. Nothing about waking up gives her new information about the flip itself. The probability stays 50-50. The other camp says 1/3. If the coin landed heads, there is 1 awakening. If it landed tails, there are 2. Since she cannot tell which awakening she is in, and tails produces twice as many awakenings, she should assign 1/3 probability to heads and 2/3 to tails. Both answers follow from coherent reasoning. Both are defended by serious philosophers and mathematicians, and they cannot both be right. The paradox reveals a genuine disagreement about what probability means. Is it a fact about the world independent of the observer? Or is it always relative to the information and perspective of the person assigning it? And if probability is perspective dependent, then 2 people reasoning perfectly about the same situation can reach different correct answers, which makes certainty about anything involving probability stranger than it already seemed. Level 91. The paradox of knowing too much. What if having more information made you worse at making decisions? A chess grandmaster does not consider every possible move. They use pattern recognition to narrow the field to a handful of relevant options and then reason deeply about those. Beginners try to calculate everything and become overwhelmed. Experts use selective attention shaped by years of experience. Now give the grandmaster access to a computer that can calculate every possible position 20 moves ahead. The computer is objectively better at calculating than the grandmaster, but the grandmaster with the computer does not always play better than the grandmaster alone. Because knowing every option is not the same as knowing which options matter, and having too much information can flood the pattern recognition systems that normally filter signal from noise. This happens outside chess too. Doctors with access to more diagnostic tests sometimes make worse diagnoses because each new test produces new possibilities and new uncertainties. Investors with access to more financial data sometimes make worse investments because the additional data introduces noise that disrupts the intuitions that have been working. At some point, more information stops helping and starts hurting. The signal gets buried in the data. The decision maker gets paralyzed by the number of paths. The paradox is that in a world that rewards gathering more information, the ability to ignore most of it may be one of the most valuable skills there is. And it is not a skill that looks like skill from the outside. It looks like not paying attention. Level 92. The paradox of the infinite regress of justification. What if every belief you held required justification, and every justification required another justification, and the chain never ended? You believe the floor will hold your weight when you step on it. Why? Because floors like this one have held weight before. Why trust that? Because physical materials behave consistently. Why believe that? Because science has confirmed it. Why trust science? Because it has produced reliable predictions. Why trust that past reliability predicts future reliability? And there it is again. The problem of induction hiding inside the attempt to justify belief. Every justification sits on another belief that also needs justifying. The chain does not end. It either goes on forever or stops at something you accept without justification. Philosophers call the 3 options here the Munchausen trilemma, named after the fictional baron who claimed to have pulled himself out of a swamp by his own hair. The first option is infinite regress, justifications going back forever with no foundation. The second is circular reasoning. Eventually the chain loops back and some belief justifies itself. The third is a basic belief, something you accept without further justification as a stopping point. All 3 are unsatisfying. None of them gives you what you actually want, which is a chain of justifications that ends somewhere solid and external and certain. Every system of knowledge you have ever used was built on one of these 3 foundations, and none of them is as solid as the knowledge built on top of it feels. Level 93. The Paradox of Moral Luck. What if you deserved praise or blame for things that were entirely outside your control? 2 people drive home drunk. One makes it home safely.
No one is hurt. He wakes up the next morning with a hangover and a vague sense that he should not have done that. The other hits a child who runs into the road. She is charged with vehicular manslaughter. Her life is destroyed. Both made the same decision. Both were equally reckless. Both took the same moral risk. But one faces devastating consequences and the other faces almost none. We feel that the second driver is more blameworthy than the first. Courts treat her more harshly. Her own conscience will punish her more severely. The difference in our moral judgment is not based on any difference in their choices or intentions. It is based entirely on luck, on whether a child happened to run into the road. Philosopher Thomas Nagel called this moral luck and argued that it exposes a deep problem in how we think about responsibility. We want to hold people responsible only for what they could control, but our actual moral judgments are constantly infected by factors outside anyone's control. Outcomes, circumstances, the situations people find themselves in through no choice of their own. You cannot fully solve this. You cannot judge people purely on intentions because outcomes matter. But judging on outcomes means letting luck determine moral status. Every system of moral judgment navigates this problem without resolving it. And every person who has ever felt guilt about an outcome they could not have predicted has felt it in their body. Level 94. The paradox of the self-fulfilling prophecy. What if believing something strongly enough made it true even if it would not have been otherwise? A bank is financially sound. Its loans are good. Its reserves are adequate. There is no rational reason for it to fail. But a rumor spreads that it is in trouble. Depositors start withdrawing money. More people hear about the withdrawals and withdraw their own money to be safe. The withdrawals exceed the bank's liquid reserves. The bank fails. The bank was sound. The prophecy that it would fail created the failure. The belief caused the thing it described. This happens in social systems constantly. A student is told they are not good at mathematics. They stop trying. They perform poorly. The prediction is confirmed. A politician is predicted to lose. Donors stop giving. Volunteers stop showing up. The campaign runs out of resources. The prediction is confirmed. The prediction changed the behavior that determined the outcome. The forecast altered the future it was forecasting. This makes social prediction fundamentally different from physical prediction. Predicting where a ball will land does not change where it lands. Predicting what a person will do can change what they do. Human systems are reflexive in a way that physical systems are not, which means the most powerful thing about a widely believed prediction about human affairs is not its accuracy. It is its believability. True or false, the believed prediction shapes the reality it describes. And this means that the people who control what predictions get widely believed control something more powerful than information. They control which futures become possible. Level 95. The paradox of perfect memory. What if remembering everything perfectly made it impossible to understand anything? A person with perfect memory would remember every experience in exact detail, every conversation word for word, every face in exact proportion, every moment preserved with complete fidelity. But understanding requires abstraction. To understand what a chair is, you have to form a concept that covers all chairs despite their differences. You have to ignore the specific and extract the general. You have to forget the details and keep the pattern. Perfect memory would make this impossible. Every chair you had ever seen would remain as a specific individual memory. The concept chair would have to hold an infinite number of perfectly preserved specific instances. Generalization would require losing specificity, but with perfect memory, you would not lose specificity. You would be buried in it. Jorge Luis Borges explored this in his story about Funes the Memorious, a man who after an accident remembered everything perfectly. Funes could not understand sleep because sleeping meant not thinking, and not thinking meant gaps in the otherwise perfect record. He found it difficult to understand that a dog seen from the front and from the side was the same dog. The two views were two different memories with no necessary connection. Perfect memory produced perfect idiocy, not in the insulting sense, but in the original sense. An inability to generalize, an inability to see the same thing twice. Understanding is only possible because we forget. What we remember is the meaningful residue after the forgetting is done. Level 96. Wheeler's delayed choice. What if a decision you made now could change what a particle did in the past? In the double-slit experiment, particles behave like waves when unobserved, and like particles when observed. The act of measurement determines which behavior occurs. Physicist John Wheeler proposed a more disturbing version. What if you waited until after the particle had already passed the slits to decide whether to measure it? Could your choice now change what happened then? The experiment has been run. The answer appears to be yes. A photon is fired at a barrier with 2 slits. Before the photon reaches the screen, a fast switch determines whether a measuring device is in place. If the device is there, the photon behaves like a particle and shows a particle pattern. If the device is not there, it behaves like a wave and shows an interference pattern. The choice of whether to measure is made after the photon has passed the slits. Yet the photon's behavior at the slits seems to match the future measurement. The standard interpretation does not say the photon traveled back in time to change its behavior. It says the photon did not have a definite behavior until the measurement was made. Its history was not fixed until the future moment of observation. The past is not fully real until something in the present determines it, which means the history of the universe may be in some sense being written from the future backward, and what we call the past may be less settled than we assumed. Level 97. The Paradox of the Invincible Ignorance. What if the things that were most important to understand were exactly the things your mind was least equipped to understand? Evolution built your brain to solve problems in a specific range: finding food, navigating social hierarchies, tracking moving objects at human speeds, reasoning about the near future, making decisions under uncertainty in environments like the ones your ancestors lived in. It did not build your brain to understand quantum mechanics, or to intuitively grasp the implications of deep time, or to reason correctly about very large probabilities, or to feel the reality of a billion people suffering in the abstract. These are exactly the kinds of things that matter most in the modern world, but they are outside the range your brain was built for. You can learn the formulas and the facts, but you cannot feel them the way you feel a rock in your hand, or a threat in your immediate environment. This is not a failure of intelligence. Einstein could not intuitively feel quantum mechanics either. The incompatibility is between the architecture of human cognition and the scale of the problems modern humans need to reason about, which means the most important decisions you face are the ones your brain handles worst: the long-term, the global, the statistical, the abstract. And you will nonetheless make those decisions with the brain you have, and you will often feel confident while doing it.
The confidence is the worst part. Level 98. The Paradox of the Last Moment. What if every moment felt like it could be the last, and that feeling was the only thing that made moments feel like anything? There is a thought experiment sometimes given to people in therapy. Imagine this is the last time you will ever do this ordinary thing, the last time you will ever walk in this neighborhood, the last time you will ever sit in this chair, the last time you will ever talk to this person. Most people report that imagining finality makes the experience suddenly vivid in a way it was not before. The detail sharpens, the feeling deepens. The thing that was routine becomes something you are actually inside. But if you tried to maintain that feeling permanently, you would exhaust yourself. The intensity would become unbearable. You cannot live in the last moment all the time. The mind adapts, the sharpness fades, things become routine again. So the vivid feeling only comes when you are leaving something or believing you might be, and you can sometimes summon it by imagining you are. But the moment you successfully summon it, you know it is a trick, and the trick half fails because you know you will be back tomorrow. The only fully authentic version of the feeling comes when the ending is real, which you cannot arrange in advance for most of your life, which means most of your life is experienced at a fraction of the intensity it would have if you knew it was ending, and the fraction you are currently experiencing is what you have, and it is enough to live on. But you will always wonder what the full version would have felt like. Level 99. The Paradox of the Drifting Mind. What if the paradoxes were not the strange things an ordinary certainty was? You have spent a long time now drifting through ideas that loop and contradict and dissolve the moment you try to hold them. Logic breaking on itself, identity turning out to be a story, time bending under observation, consciousness defying explanation, knowledge resting on foundations that cannot justify themselves, the future open and the past not quite settled, and maybe this has started to feel like the natural state of things. Not disturbing but familiar, the way it actually is when you stop demanding that it be otherwise. Because certainty is the strange thing, the sense that you know what you are, where you are,
what is real, what time it is, whether any of this is exactly as it seems. That feeling of solid ground, that is the thing that takes work to maintain. The paradoxes are just what happens when the maintenance stops for a moment and you look at what is actually there. The mind that drifts stops demanding resolution. It holds the question without needing the answer. It finds that the unanswerable question is not a failure. It is the most honest relationship available to a mind that is genuinely paying attention. And somewhere in that drift, between the last paradox and sleep, the questions stop feeling like problems. They start feeling like the texture of being alive, unresolved, ongoing, strangely restful. You do not need the answers tonight. You are drifting now. Level 100, the paradox of everything. What if the search for the answer to everything was itself the answer? You have drifted through 100 paradoxes now, 100 questions that refused to close, logic that ate itself, identity that dissolved under examination, time that bent, reality that shifted when observed, knowledge that could not justify its own foundations, infinity that came in different sizes, consciousness that remained mysterious to itself, a universe so precisely tuned for life that its existence bordered on impossible, rightful ask, and at no point did any of it resolve. Every paradox pointed at something, and when you followed the pointing finger to its end, there was another pointing finger. The explanations explained themselves into new questions. The answers became the next level of the problem. The floor kept turning out to be a ceiling viewed from underneath. And here is the thing that has been true this entire time. You kept going anyway. Not because the answers were coming, not because the next level would finally be the one that settled everything, but because something in you was drawn forward by the questions themselves. Something found the unresolved more interesting than the resolved. Something in you preferred the open door to the closed room, even when the open door led to another open door. That is the paradox of everything. The mind that wants complete understanding is the same mind that would stop working the moment it had it. A universe that was fully explained would be a universe with no more explaining to do, and a mind with no more explaining to do would have nothing left to be. The search is not a path to the destination. The search is the destination. It always was. Every question you have ever sat with, every moment of not knowing that kept you awake. Every idea that felt just out of reach, that was not frustration. That was the feeling of being alive in the only way a mind can be fully alive, reaching towards something it will not completely hold. The universe is not waiting to be understood. It is waiting to be questioned. And you have been doing that your whole life without realizing it was enough. There are no more levels after this one, but there are more questions. There are always more questions. And somewhere between this moment and sleep, your mind will find one and follow it down into the dark. And that is not a problem to solve. That is just what minds do when they are finally free to drift. Good night.